Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the wind howled through the cracks in the weathered stone walls of the stronghold, carrying with it the first flakes of snow. Thorvald stood atop the watchtower, his grizzled face etched with worry as he gazed out at the vast expanse of the northern wilderness. His hand, calloused from years of wielding a sword, gripped the hilt of his weapon unconsciously. A young warrior, barely out of his teens, scrambled up the ladder to the tower platform. "Chieftain Thorvald," he called out, slightly out of breath. "A rider approaches from the east." Thorvald turned, his steel-gray eyes fixing on the youth. "Show me," he commanded, his voice low and gravelly. Together, they peered into the distance. A lone figure on horseback was indeed galloping towards the stronghold, kicking up a trail of dust behind them. "Open the gates," Thorvald shouted down to the guards below, "and summon the council. We may have trouble brewing." As Thorvald descended from the tower, the stronghold burst into activity. Warriors donned their armor, mothers ushered children indoors, and the air filled with a palpable tension. The rider, now identified as Bjorn, one of their scouts, dismounted at the gates, his horse lathered with sweat. "Chieftain," Bjorn gasped, dropping to one knee before Thorvald, "I bring grave news. The Black Wolf clan approaches with an army larger than any we've seen before. They march under the banner of Gunnar the Cruel." Murmurs of fear and anger rippled through the gathered crowd. Thorvald's face remained impassive, but his eyes flashed with a mix of determination and concern. "How many?" he asked, his voice steady. Bjorn shook his head. "Too many to count, my lord. Thousands, at least. They'll be upon us within 3 days, if not sooner." Thorvald nodded grimly. "You've done well, Bjorn. Rest now. We have much to prepare." He turned to address the growing crowd. "My people, dark times are upon us, but we are the children of the North, forged in ice and tempered by hardship. We will face this threat as we have faced all others, with courage and strength." A cheer went up from the assembled warriors, but Thorvald could see the fear behind their brave faces. He made his way to the great hall where the clan's council awaited. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the voices inside fell silent. Astrid, the clan's wisest elder, spoke first. "Is it true, Thorvald? Has Gunnar finally made his move against us?" Thorvald nodded, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Aye, it's true. Bjorn reports an army larger than we've ever faced, marching under Gunnar's banner." Halfdan, the master blacksmith, slammed his fist on the table. "Let them come. We'll send them back to Gunnar in pieces." "And how many of our own will we lose in the process?" countered Ingrid the healer. "Our stores are low, and winter is upon us. We cannot withstand a prolonged siege." Thorvald raised his hand, silencing the brewing argument. "You all speak truth. We are outmatched and ill-prepared for a long battle, but we have something Gunnar and his army do not. This is our home, and we will defend it with every drop of blood in our veins." He stood, pacing the length of the table. "Halfdan, I need every able-bodied man and woman armed and armored. Ingrid, take stock of our medical supplies and prepare for casualties. Astrid, I want you to oversee the evacuation of the children and elderly to the caves in the mountains." "Evacuation?" Astrid's eyes widened. "Surely it hasn't come to that, Thorvald." The chieftain's face was grim. "I pray to the gods it won't be necessary, but we must be prepared for every eventuality. If the stronghold falls, our people must survive." As the council dispersed to carry out their tasks, Thorvald's son, Eirik, approached him. The young man's face was a mirror of his father's determination. "Father, let me lead a group of warriors to harass the approaching army," Eirik pleaded. "We can slow them down, buy us more time to prepare." Thorvald placed a hand on his son's shoulder. pride and fear warring in his heart. "No, Eric, I need you here. If I fall, you must lead our people. You are the future of our clan." Eric opened his mouth to protest, but seeing the resolve in his father's eyes, he simply nodded. "I understand, Father. I won't let you down." As the day wore on, the stronghold transformed into a hive of activity. Warriors sharpened blades and repaired armor, while others reinforced the walls and gates. Women and children gathered supplies and prepared for the possibility of evacuation. The air was thick with the smell of weapon oil and the sound of hammering. Thorvald oversaw it all, offering encouragement here, advice there, and everywhere instilling a sense of purpose and hope. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the stronghold, he made his way back to the watchtower. The scout, Bjorn, joined him there, having rested and recovered from his long ride. "What do you see, chieftain?" he asked, squinting into the gathering darkness. Thorvald was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I see the end of an era, Bjorn," he said softly. "Whether we stand or fall in the coming days, nothing will ever be the same for our people." Bjorn nodded solemnly. "It has been an honor to serve under you, Thorvald. Whatever comes, we will face it together." As if nature itself sensed the impending conflict, the snow began to fall more heavily. Thorvald watched as the white flakes swirled in the wind, gradually blanketing the world in a deceptive peacefulness. "Gather the warriors," Thorvald commanded, his voice carrying the weight of his responsibility. "It's time they knew what we face." In the great hall, packed to the rafters with every fighting man and woman in the clan, Thorvald stood before his people. The flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with anticipation and fear. "My friends, my family," Thorvald began, his voice resonating through the hall. "For generations, we have called this land our home. We have weathered harsh winters, fended off rival clans, and built a life of honor and strength. Now we face our greatest challenge." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the assembled faces, young and old, seasoned warriors and those who had never seen battle. "Gunnar the Cruel marches upon us with an army that outnumbers us many times over. They come not for glory or honor, but to destroy us, to wipe our clan from the face of this earth. I will not lie to you. Our chances are slim. Many of us may not live to see the spring." A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd, but Thorvald raised his hand for silence. "But we are not without hope. We fight not just for our lives, but for our homes, our families, our very way of life. Every one of you, man, woman, and child, carries the strength of our ancestors in your blood. We may be outnumbered, but we will make Gunnar pay for every inch of our land with the blood of his men." A cheer went up, the sound of it shaking the very rafters of the hall. Thorvald let it wash over him, drawing strength from the courage of his people. "Prepare yourselves," he continued as the noise died down. "In the coming days we will be tested as never before. But remember this, so long as one of us draws breath, our clan lives on. We fight not just for today, but for all the tomorrows to come." As the meeting dispersed, Thorvald felt a tug at his sleeve. He looked down to see Astrid, her aged face creased with concern. "Thorvald," she said softly, "I've known you since you were a babe in arms. I've never seen you so burdened." Thorvald sighed, allowing a moment of vulnerability in the presence of the old woman who had been like a mother to him. "How can I not be, Astrid? The lives of everyone here rest on my shoulders. If I fail..." Astrid took his large calloused hand in her small wrinkled ones. "You bear this burden because you are strong enough to carry it. The gods chose you to lead us for a reason, Thorvald. Trust in their wisdom and in yourself." Thorvald squeezed her hand gently, drawing comfort from her unwavering faith. "Thank you, Astrid. Your words give me strength." As Astrid hobbled away to begin preparations for the evacuation, Thorvald stepped outside the hall. The snow was falling more heavily now, the flakes swirling in the torchlight. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs and steeling his resolve. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, he thought he heard the faint sound of war drums. The enemy was coming, and with them, a storm that would test the very foundations of everything Thorvald and his people held dear. With a final glance at the snowy expanse beyond the stronghold walls, Thorvald turned and strode back inside. There was much to do and precious little time. The fate of his clan hung in the balance, and he would be damned if he didn't do everything in his power to tip the scales in their favor. As the night deepened and the snow continued to fall, the clan prepared for the battle that would determine their future. In every corner of the stronghold, the air thrummed with a mixture of fear, determination, and the unshakable bond of a people united in the face of overwhelming odds. The dawn broke cold and gray over the stronghold, the early morning light revealing a sea of dark figures on the horizon. Thorvald stood atop the walls, his breath misting in the frigid air as he gazed out at the approaching army. The sight was enough to make even the bravest warrior's heart quail. "By the gods," whispered Eric, standing at his father's side. "There must be thousands of them." Thorvald nodded grimly. "Aye, and more beyond what we can see. Gunnar has emptied his lands to bring this force against us." The Black Wolf clan's army stretched as far as the eye could see, a dark mass that seemed to devour the pristine, snow-covered landscape. Banners bearing the snarling visage of a black wolf fluttered in the icy wind, and the dull thud of war drums echoed across the plain. As the gravity of their situation settled over the defenders, murmurs of fear and despair began to ripple through their ranks. Thorvald knew he had to act quickly to rally his people's spirits. "Warriors of the North," he roared, his voice carrying over the battlements. "Hear me!" All eyes turned to their chieftain, standing tall and proud, despite the overwhelming odds arrayed against them. "I see fear in your eyes," Thorvald continued, pacing along the wall. "And there is no shame in that. Only a fool feels no fear in the face of death. But I also see courage, determination, and the fire that burns in the heart of every true warrior." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the assembled defenders, men and women, young and old, all ready to lay down their lives for their clan. "Look out there," he said, gesturing to the approaching horde. "Gunnar thinks he can crush us with sheer numbers. He believes that because he has more men, victory is assured. But he is wrong." Thorvald's voice rose, filled with passion and conviction. "For every one of us they will need 10. Our walls are strong, our arms are strong, but strongest of all are our hearts. We fight not for glory or gold, but for our homes, our families, our very way of life." A cheer went up from the defenders, the sound of it drowning out the enemy's war drums for a moment. "Let them come!" Thorvald roared, drawing his sword and raising it high. The blade caught the morning light, gleaming like a beacon of hope. "Let them break themselves against our walls, and let each of you fight as though the fate of our people rests on your shoulders alone. For in truth it does. Stand fast, fight hard, and know that songs will be sung of this day for generations to come." The cheer that erupted was deafening. Weapons were raised, shields were pounded, and the air filled with battle cries. Thorvald had done it. He had kindled the fire of hope in the hearts of his people. But there was no more time for words. The enemy had reached the base of the stronghold's walls, and with a thunderous crash, the first wave of attackers surged forward. Ladders were raised against the walls, grappling hooks were thrown, and the air filled with the whistle of arrows. The defenders responded in kind, raining down rocks, spears, and boiling oil upon the attackers. Thorvald was everywhere at once, shouting encouragement, directing defenses, and lending his sword arm wherever the fighting was thickest. His blade rose and fell in a deadly arc, sending Black Wolf warriors tumbling from the walls. "Hold the line," he bellowed as a group of enemy soldiers managed to gain a foothold on the battlements. "Push them back." Eric fought at his father's side, his younger strength complementing Thorvald's experience. Together, they were a whirlwind of steel and fury, stemming the tide of attackers. Hours passed, and still, the enemy came on. For every attacker cut down, 2 more seemed to take their place. The defenders were tiring, their arms growing heavy, their movements slower. As the sun reached its zenith, a group of Black Wolf berserkers, mad with bloodlust, broke through the defense. They carved a bloody path through the defenders, heading straight for Thorvald. "Father, look out," Eric cried, but he was too far away to help. Thorvald turned, raising his shield just in time to deflect a massive axe blow. The force of it drove him to one knee, and he looked up to see a giant of a man, foam flecking his beard, raising his axe for a killing blow. But the blow never fell. A blur of motion interposed itself between Thorvald and the berserker. It was Bjorn, the young scout who had first brought news of the approaching army. Bjorn's sword found a gap in the berserker's armor, burying itself to the hilt. But even as the giant fell, his axe completed its deadly arc, catching Bjorn across the chest. "No!" Thorvald roared, surging to his feet. He caught Bjorn as the young warrior collapsed, blood spreading across his tunic. My chieftain," Bjorn gasped, a smile on his pale lips. I did my duty." "You did more than your duty, lad," Thorvald said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all. Your name will be remembered with honor." Bjorn's eyes glazed over, his last breath escaping in a soft sigh. Thorvald gently laid him down, then turned to face the ongoing battle, his eyes blazing with renewed fury. "For Bjorn!" he roared, charging back into the fray. His warriors took up the cry, fighting with redoubled vigor in honor of their fallen comrade. The battle raged on as the sun began its descent towards the western horizon. The snow-covered ground around the stronghold was stained crimson, littered with bodies from both sides. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of smoke from fires that had broken out during the fighting. As darkness began to fall, the attacks finally began to slacken. The Black Wolf forces, despite their overwhelming numbers, had failed to breach the stronghold's defenses. Horns sounded across the enemy camp, signaling a retreat. The defenders watched warily as their foes withdrew, hardly daring to believe that they had survived the day. Thorvald, his armor dented and bloodied, made his way along the walls, checking on his people and assessing the damage. "We've held them off for now," Eirik said, joining his father. The moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the snow-covered courtyard of the stronghold. Thorvald's footsteps crunched softly as he made his final rounds, checking the defenses one last time before allowing himself a few hours of much-needed rest. The past 2 days had been a blur of preparation, strategy meetings, and bolstering the morale of his people. Now, in the quiet of the night, the weight of their situation pressed heavily upon him. As he approached the main gate, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Thorvald froze, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. There, in the shadows, a figure was hunched over the gate's locking mechanism. "Who goes there?" Thorvald called out, his voice cutting through the stillness of the night. The figure jerked upright, spinning to face him. In the pale moonlight, Thorvald recognized the face of Leif, one of his most trusted warriors. "Leif, what are you doing at the gate at this hour?" Thorvald asked, his suspicion growing with each passing moment. Leif's eyes darted nervously, his hand moving to the dagger at his belt. "Chieftain, I was just checking the locks, making sure they were secure." Thorvald took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the locks tampering. "You lie," he growled, drawing his sword. "You're trying to open the gate for the enemy, aren't you?" Leif's face contorted with a mix of fear and defiance. "You don't understand, Thorvald. Gunnar's forces are too strong. He promised to spare those who help him. I'm trying to save us all." With a cry of rage and betrayal, Thorvald lunged forward. Leif barely managed to draw his own weapon in time to parry the blow. The clash of steel echoed through the courtyard, rousing the nearby guards. "Traitor!" Thorvald roared, pressing his attack. "You would doom us all to save your own skin?" Leif fought back desperately, his skill as a warrior evident even in his treachery. "It's over, Thorvald. Can't you see we're all going to die if we resist?" Their blades locked, faces inches apart. Thorvald could see the fear in Leif's eyes, but also the resolve. This was no moment of weakness, but a calculated betrayal. Guards rushed to the scene surrounding the fighting pair. "Stay back," Thorvald commanded, never taking his eyes off Leif. "This is between us." The fight raged on, both men giving everything they had. Leif, driven by desperation and fear, fought with a frenzied energy. But Thorvald, fueled by righteous anger and the weight of his responsibility, was relentless. Finally, with a powerful sweep of his blade, Thorvald disarmed Leif, sending the traitor's weapon clattering across the stones. Leif fell to his knees, panting and defeated. "Mercy, chieftain," Leif pleaded, his earlier bravado crumbling. I was wrong. I see that now." Thorvald stood over him, chest heaving, his sword point at Leif's throat. The gathered crowd watched in tense silence, waiting to see what their leader would do. In that moment, a cry of pain erupted from the crowd. Thorvald turned to see Astrid clutching her chest, her face pale with shock. "My son," she whispered, her eyes locked on Leif. "What have you done?" The realization hit Thorvald like a physical blow. Leif was Astrid's only surviving child, her pride and joy. The cost of this betrayal suddenly became painfully clear. With a heavy heart, Thorvald made his decision. "Take him to the cells," he commanded the guards. "He will face the judgment of our people when this crisis has passed." As Leif was led away, the courtyard erupted into a cacophony of angry voices. Accusations flew, suspicions were raised, and the unity that Thorvald had worked so hard to build began to fracture. "How do we know there aren't more traitors among us?" someone shouted. "We should question everyone," another voice added. "No one can be trusted." Thorvald raised his hand for silence, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough. This is exactly what our enemies want, for us to turn against each other. We cannot let fear and suspicion divide us now." He looked around at the faces of his people, seeing the doubt and fear in their eyes. "I know you're scared. I know you're angry. But we cannot let this betrayal poison us. Each of you must look into your hearts and remember why we fight. Not just for our lives, but for our way of life, for the future of our children." Astrid stepped forward, her face lined with grief, but her voice steady. "Thorvald speaks truly. My son has made a terrible choice, but his actions do not define us. We are stronger than this treachery." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Thorvald could see that the damage had been done. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. As the crowd dispersed, Thorvald pulled his closest advisors aside. "We need to be vigilant," he said in a low voice. "But we cannot let paranoia rule us. Spread the word. Any suspicious activity is to be reported directly to me or to you, but we must maintain the appearance of unity." Eric, Thorvald's son, spoke up. "Father, what of Leif? The people will demand justice." Thorvald sighed heavily. "Justice will come, but not at the cost of our humanity. For now, he remains in the cells. We have bigger concerns." As if to punctuate his words, a horn blasted in the distance, the signal from their outermost watchposts. The enemy was on the move. "To arms," Thorvald shouted, his voice carrying across the stronghold. "They come under cover of night." The relative quiet of the night erupted into frantic activity. Warriors rushed to don their armor and take up their positions. Archers scrambled to the walls, knocking arrows to their bows. Thorvald raced to the watchtower, his heart pounding. As he reached the top, he saw them. Torches in the darkness, hundreds of them, moving swiftly towards the stronghold. "They must have been waiting for a signal," Eric said, joining his father. "Leif's signal." Thorvald nodded grimly. "And now they think our gate will open for them. They're in for a surprise." Below he could hear the shouts and clangs of his people preparing for battle. Despite the betrayal, despite the fear, they were ready to fight. Thorvald felt a surge of pride mixed with sorrow. How many would survive the night? As the enemy drew closer, their war cries carrying on the wind, Thorvald drew his sword. The blade gleamed in the moonlight, a beacon of defiance against the encroaching darkness. "Archers," he called out. "Ready your bows. Wait for my signal." The tension was palpable as the enemy force charged towards the gate, clearly expecting it to swing open. When it remained steadfastly closed, confusion rippled through their ranks. "Now!" Thorvald roared. A hail of arrows rained down upon the surprised attackers, cutting down the front lines. Cries of pain and anger rose up, mixing with the shouts of Thorvald's defenders. "They'll try to bring up siege equipment," Eric said, watching the chaos below. "We need to keep them off balance." Thorvald nodded. "Take a group and prepare for a sortie. When I give the signal, hit them from the side. We'll crush them between hammer and anvil." As Eric rushed off to gather his warriors, Thorvald turned his attention back to the battle. The enemy, recovering from their initial surprise, was regrouping. He could see their commanders shouting orders, reorganizing for a proper siege. "Not today," Thorvald muttered. He raised his sword high, the signal for Eric's sortie. A moment later, a section of the wall seemed to come alive as hidden doors swung open, disgorging a flood of defenders into the enemy's flank. The battle raged on through the night, the snow-covered ground turning red with blood. Thorvald fought alongside his people, his sword a blur of motion, his voice rising above the din to encourage and direct. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the enemy finally retreated, leaving their dead and wounded scattered before the stronghold's walls. Thorvald, exhausted and blood-spattered, looked out over the battlefield. They had won this skirmish, but at a cost. Too many of his people lay still among the enemy dead. "Gather the wounded," he commanded, his voice hoarse from shouting. "Burn the enemy dead, and someone bring me Leaf." It's time he saw the consequences of his actions. As his orders were carried out, Thorvald allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The betrayal, the battle, the losses. All of it weighed heavily upon him. But as he watched his people moving purposefully in the aftermath of the fight, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had faced treachery from within and attack from without, and they had survived. Whatever came next, Thorvald knew his clan would face it together. The sun had barely risen, its weak light struggling to penetrate the thick clouds that hung low over the battlefield. Thorvald stood atop the battered walls of the stronghold, his eyes scanning the enemy lines. The brief respite following their night victory had been short-lived. Gunnar's forces had regrouped, and now they pressed against the defenses with renewed vigor. "They're bringing up the ram," Eric reported, joining his father on the ramparts. "Our outer gates won't hold for long." Thorvald nodded grimly. "Then we'll meet them before they reach the gates. Gather the men, son. It's time we showed these dogs the fury of our clan." As Eric rushed off to assemble their warriors, Thorvald turned to his old friend and right-hand man Bjorn. "You'll hold the walls while we're out there. If we fall, seal the inner keep and protect our people for as long as you can." Bjorn clasped Thorvald's arm, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "May the gods watch over you, old friend. Show them no mercy." With a nod, Thorvald descended to the courtyard where his warriors had assembled. Their faces were grim but determined, each man and woman ready to lay down their life for their clan. "My brothers and sisters in arms," Thorvald's voice boomed across the yard. "The enemy thinks us weak, thinks us broken. They believe their numbers will overwhelm us. But they forget, we are the children of the North. Our blood runs cold as ice and burns hot as fire. Today, we remind them why our clan has stood for generations." A roar went up from the assembled warriors, weapons raised high in salute. "For our home, for our families, for our future," Thorvald shouted, raising his sword. "For the clan," came the thunderous response. The gates creaked open, and with a mighty battle cry, Thorvald led the charge. They poured out of the stronghold like a tide of steel and fury, crashing into the surprised enemy lines. Thorvald was a whirlwind of destruction, his sword singing a deadly song as it cleaved through armor and flesh. Beside him, Eirik fought with the strength and skill that made Thorvald's heart swell with pride. For a moment, it seemed as if they might push the enemy back entirely. Gunnar's forces, caught off guard by the ferocity of the counterattack, began to waver. But then, from the enemy ranks, a huge warrior emerged. Clad in black armor and wielding a massive warhammer, he cut a swath through Thorvald's men. "Gunnar," Thorvald growled, recognizing his old nemesis. Before he could reach him, however, a cry of pain cut through the chaos. Thorvald turned to see his lifelong friend, Halfdan the blacksmith, fall beneath an enemy blade. "No," Thorvald roared, fighting his way to Halfdan's side. But he was too late. The light was already fading from Halfdan's eyes as Thorvald cradled his head. Did I make you proud, old friend?" Halfdan gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. Thorvald's voice cracked as he replied, "Always, brother. Always." With a final shuddering breath, Halfdan was gone. Thorvald felt as if a piece of his own heart had been torn away. For a moment he knelt there, the battle raging around him, as the weight of loss threatened to crush his spirit. "Father!" Eric's shout snapped Thorvald back to the present. "We can't hold them. We need to fall back." Raising his head, Thorvald saw that his son spoke true. Despite their initial success, the sheer numbers of the enemy were beginning to tell. His warriors were being pushed back towards the gates, fighting desperately for every step. "Sound the retreat," Thorvald commanded, his voice hoarse with grief and exertion. "Back to the walls." As they fell back, Thorvald saw Gunnar watching from the enemy lines, a cruel smile on his face. This skirmish had cost them dearly, and they both knew it. Once inside the stronghold, Thorvald ordered the gates sealed. But the respite was brief. The sound of the battering ram echoed across the courtyard, each impact sending tremors through the ground. "The outer wall won't hold much longer," Bjorn reported, his face grim. "We've lost too many defenders." Thorvald nodded, his mind racing for a solution. "We'll make our stand at the inner keep. Every warrior, every man and woman who can hold a weapon. This is where we—" His words were cut short by an ear-splitting crack. The outer gates, weakened by the constant battering, finally gave way. Enemy soldiers poured through the breach, their war cries filling the air. "To the keep!" Thorvald shouted, organizing a fighting retreat. "Protect the civilians!" The clash of steel on steel filled the air as Thorvald's warriors fought desperately to hold back the tide of enemies. Step by step, they were forced back, leaving a trail of bodies, both friend and foe, in their wake. As they reached the inner keep, Thorvald turned to make a final stand at the entrance. "Hold them here," he commanded. "No matter the cost." The battle raged on, with Thorvald and his remaining warriors forming a living wall against the onslaught. But for every enemy they cut down, two more seemed to take their place. Exhaustion began to take its toll, arms growing heavy, reaction slowing. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a horn blast cut through the din of battle. Thorvald's heart leapt. He knew that sound. From the hills behind the stronghold, a fresh force of warriors appeared, charging down towards the enemy's exposed rear. At their head rode a figure Thorvald recognized even at this distance, his younger son, Håkon, whom he had sent to their allies for aid weeks ago. "Reinforcements!" The cry went up among the defenders, new energy flooding their tired bodies. Caught between Thorvald's forces and the newcomers, the enemy began to falter. Gunnar's voice could be heard bellowing orders, trying to reorganize his troops. As the tide of battle turned, Thorvald spotted a strange sight amid the chaos. A figure, cloaked and hooded, moved through the battlefield with unnatural speed and grace. Wherever this mysterious warrior went, enemy soldiers fell like wheat before a scythe. "Father!" Eric called out, pointing. "Do you see that? Who is that?" Thorvald shook his head, bewildered. "I know not, son, but they fight on our side, and for that, I'm grateful." With the combined forces of Thorvald's defenders, Hakon's reinforcements, and the deadly efficiency of the mysterious warrior, the enemy was driven back. As the sun began to set, Gunnar sounded the retreat, his decimated forces fleeing into the gathering darkness. In the aftermath, as the wounded were tended and the dead mourned, Thorvald sought out the cloaked figure who had turned the tide of battle, but the warrior had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. Hakon approached his father, clasping him in a fierce embrace. "We came as fast as we could," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I feared we might be too late." Thorvald held his son tight, allowing himself a moment of relief. "You came exactly when we needed you most, my boy. You've saved us all." As night fell, Thorvald gathered his people in the great hall. Faces streaked with blood and grime looked up at him, a mix of exhaustion, grief, and tentative hope in their eyes. "We have won a great victory today," Thorvald began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "But our fight is not over. Gunnar will return, and we must be ready. We've shown him and his forces what it means to face the wrath of our clan, and we will continue to do so no matter how many times he comes at us." A cheer went up from the assembled clan members, their spirits bolstered by the day's triumph. As the noise died down, Eric stepped forward. "Father, what of the mysterious warrior? Should we not try to find them, to thank them for their aid?" Thorvald nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, we owe them a great debt, but something tells me they will reveal themselves when the time is right. For now, we must focus on rebuilding our defenses and preparing for Gunnar's next move." As the clan dispersed to their tasks, Thorvald found a quiet moment to reflect. They had survived this battle, but at a great cost. The loss of Halfdan and so many others weighed heavily on his heart. And the appearance of the mysterious warrior raised as many questions as it answered. Looking out over the snow-covered battlefield, now stained red with the day's fighting, Thorvald knew that this was but a brief respite. The storm of war still raged around them and greater challenges lay ahead. But for the first time since Gunnar's army had appeared on the horizon, Thorvald felt a flicker of real hope. His people had shown their strength and resilience. Whatever came next, they would face it together. With a deep breath, Thorvald turned back to the stronghold. There was work to be done, wounds to heal, and a clan to lead. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The aftermath of the battle left the stronghold in a state of cautious celebration, mixed with somber reflection. As the wounded were tended to, and the dead honored, Thorvald found himself restless, his mind churning with questions about the mysterious warrior who had turned the tide of the battle. As dawn broke, Thorvald stood atop the watchtower, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Gunnar's forces. A light snow was falling, covering the battlefield in a deceptive blanket of purity. Footsteps behind him made him turn, hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. "Peace, brother," a familiar voice called out. "I come not as a foe." Thorvald's eyes widened in shock as the cloaked figure from the battle stepped forward, lowering his hood to reveal a face Thorvald had not seen in over 2 decades. "Sigurd?" Thorvald whispered, disbelief etched on his weathered features. "Is it truly you?" Sigurd, Thorvald's long-lost brother, nodded solemnly. "It is, brother. Time has changed us both, but blood remains blood." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of years and unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Thorvald spoke, his voice a mix of anger and relief. 20 years, Sigurd. 20 years without a word. We thought you dead." Sigurd's eyes, so like Thorvald's own, filled with regret. "I know, and for that, I am sorry. But my path took me far from here, to lands and peoples you couldn't imagine. I learned things, brother, things that have brought me back now, in our clan's hour of need." Thorvald's brow furrowed. "What things?" "Speak plainly, Sigurd. We've no time for riddles with Gunnar at our gates." Sigurd reached into his cloak, pulling out an ancient scroll. "There is a prophecy, brother, one that speaks of our clan's fate in these dark times." As Sigurd unrolled the scroll, his voice took on a rhythmic cadence, reciting words that seemed to hang in the air with an otherworldly weight. "When winter's grip holds fast the land and blood of kin stains snow-white sand, 2 brothers long by fate divorced must stand as one or all is lost. The elder's strength, the younger's sight, together form the clan's true might. But beware the shadow in the night, for darkness seeks to snuff out light." Thorvald listened, his face a mask of skepticism. Prophecies and portents, Sigurd? Is this what you've returned with? We need warriors, not words. Sigurd's eyes flashed with anger. Do not dismiss what you do not understand, brother. This prophecy speaks of now, of us. It is why I have returned. Before Thorvald could respond, a horn blast from below signaled the approach of riders. Both men moved to the edge of the tower, watching as a small group on horseback approached the gates. Gunnar's men, Thorvald growled. What game does he play now? As the gates opened cautiously, allowing the riders entry under heavy guard, Thorvald and Sigurd descended to the courtyard. The lead rider, a man Thorvald recognized as one of Gunnar's lieutenants, dismounted and approached. I bring a message from Lord Gunnar, the man announced, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. He proposes a truce to discuss terms. Murmurs rippled through the gathered clan members. Thorvald stepped forward, his voice hard. And why should we trust any word from Gunnar's mouth? The messenger smiled thinly. Because, Chieftain Thorvald, he holds something you value, or rather someone. With a gesture, the messenger indicated one of the other riders, who pulled back their cloak to reveal a face Thorvald knew all too well, Astrid, the clan's eldest and wisest member. Gunnar took her in the night, the messenger continued. He offers her safe return in exchange for your attendance at a parley. Thorvald's fists clenched in rage, but before he could speak, Sigurd placed a hand on his arm. Brother, remember the prophecy. Beware the shadow in the night. This reeks of treachery. Thorvald shook off Sigurd's hand. Prophecy be damned, Sigurd. I'll not abandon Astrid to Gunnar's mercies. Turning to the messenger, he nodded grimly. Tell your master I will meet with him, but know this. If any harm comes to Astrid, there will be no place on this earth where Gunnar can hide from my wrath. As the messengers departed, Thorvald found himself confronted by both his sons and Sigurd. Eric spoke first, his voice urgent. Father, you can't go. It's clearly a trap. Håkon nodded in agreement. Let me go in your stead. I'm expendable. You are not. Thorvald shook his head. No, my sons. This is my burden to bear. I brought this war upon our people. I will see it ended, one way or another. Sigurd stepped forward, his eyes blazing. And what of the prophecy, brother? Would you throw away our clan's future on a fool's errand? Thorvald rounded on Sigurd, years of pent-up anger finally boiling over. You speak of the clan's future? You who abandoned us for 2 decades. You have no right to question my decisions, brother. While you were off chasing myths and legends, I was here, leading our people, protecting them. Where were you when we needed you? The 2 brothers stood toe-to-toe, the air between them crackling with tension. Sigurd's voice was low and dangerous when he replied. I was learning the truths that will save our people, Thorvald. The world is larger and more perilous than you know. My journey was necessary. Necessary? Thorvald scoffed. Was it necessary to leave without a word? To let your family think you dead? You speak of prophecies and fates, but you know nothing of the burdens of leadership, of the weight of lives depending on your every decision. Their argument might have come to blows had Eric not stepped between them. Enough, both of you. Father, uncle, this infighting serves no one but our enemies. We must stand united. Chastened, the brothers stepped back, though the anger still smoldered in their eyes. Thorvald took a deep breath, centering himself. You're right, son. Sigurd, we will speak more of this later. For now, I must prepare to meet with Gunnar. As Thorvald turned to leave, Sigurd called out, At least let me accompany you, brother. My skills may prove useful. Thorvald paused, considering. Finally, he nodded. Very well. But know this, Sigurd. I trust you as a warrior, but your years away have made you a stranger. Prove yourself trustworthy again, and perhaps we can mend what was broken. As preparations were made for the parley, an air of unease settled over the stronghold. Thorvald, dressed in his finest armor, stood in the great hall, giving final instructions to his sons. If I do not return, he said solemnly, lead our people well. Remember the lessons I've taught you, and above all, keep them safe. As night fell, Thorvald and Sigurd rode out to the agreed meeting place, a neutral ground between the stronghold and Gunnar's camp. The moon cast an eerie light over the snow-covered landscape, turning the world into a realm of shadows and silvery light. They arrived at the meeting place to find Gunnar already waiting, flanked by his guards. Astrid stood nearby, looking weary but unharmed. Thorvald's eyes narrowed as he dismounted, his hand never straying far from his sword. "Thorvald," Gunnar greeted, his voice oily with false warmth. "How kind of you to join us. And who is this? A new ally, perhaps?" Before Thorvald could respond, a flash of movement caught his eye. With reflexes honed by years of battle, he spun, his sword clearing its sheath just in time to deflect a dagger aimed at his back. An assassin, cloaked in black, danced back from Thorvald's counterstrike. "Treachery!" Sigurd roared, his own blade flashing in the moonlight as he engaged Gunnar's guards. Chaos erupted as hidden archers emerged from the shadows, their arrows whistling through the air. Thorvald found himself locked in combat with the assassin, a deadly dance of blade and shadow. Despite his skill, Thorvald felt the years weighing on him as he battled the younger, quicker assassin. A misstep on the slick snow cost him dearly as the assassin's blade slipped past his guard, biting deep into his side. Thorvald stumbled, pain lancing through him. He could hear Sigurd shouting his name, see Gunnar's triumphant grin. As he fell to one knee, the assassin moved in for the killing blow. But the blow never came. With a roar of fury, Sigurd appeared as if from nowhere, his blade cleaving through the assassin's neck. As the body fell, Sigurd turned to face Gunnar, his eyes burning with an otherworldly light. "You have made a grave mistake, Gunnar," Sigurd intoned, his voice carrying an unnatural resonance. "The prophecy will not be denied. The brothers stand as one and your doom is sealed." Gunnar's smug expression faltered, replaced by a look of genuine fear. With a shouted command, he and his remaining men retreated into the night, leaving Thorvald, Sigurd, and Astrid alone on the blood-stained snow. As Sigurd knelt beside his wounded brother, Thorvald looked up at him with newfound respect and understanding. "Perhaps," he gasped through the pain, "there is something to your prophecies after all, brother." Sigurd smiled grimly as he tended to Thorvald's wound. "There is much you have yet to learn, brother. But for now, let us get you home. The clan needs its chieftain, and I need my brother." As they made their way back to the stronghold, Thorvald leaning heavily on Sigurd for support, both men knew that everything had changed. The air in Thorvald's chamber was thick with the scent of medicinal herbs and the metallic tang of blood. The once mighty chieftain lay on his bed, his broad chest rising and falling with labored breaths. The wound he had sustained in the last battle festered, defying all of Ingrid's healing efforts. Eric stood at the foot of the bed, his young face etched with worry and the weight of newfound responsibility. "Father," he said softly, "the scouts report movement in Gunnar's camp. We fear they're preparing for another assault." Thorvald's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain and fever. "Then, you must lead them, my son," he rasped. "Show them the strength of our blood." Eric nodded, swallowing hard. He reached out and grasped his father's hand, feeling the unnatural heat of fever. "I will make you proud, father. Rest now and regain your strength. We'll need you before the end." As Eric left the chamber, Ingrid approached with a fresh poultice. "His fever still rages," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "If only we had more time." Outside, the stronghold bustled with grim activity. Warriors sharpened blades and repaired armor, while others reinforced walls and gathered supplies. The air was thick with tension, everyone acutely aware that their chieftain lay incapacitated at this crucial hour. Eric strode through the courtyard, projecting a confidence he didn't entirely feel. He had trained for this his entire life, but the reality of command weighed heavily upon him. As he reached the watchtower, a cry went up from the sentries. "My lord," one called down, "you must see this." Eric raced up the steps, his heart pounding. As he reached the top and looked out over the battlefield, his blood ran cold. The enemy forces were on the move, but they were not alone. Monstrous shapes lumbered among them, creatures of nightmare made flesh. "By the gods," Eirik breathed, "what devilry is this?" Beside him, the grizzled veteran Bjorn shook his head in disbelief. "Dark magic, my lord. Gunnar must have made a pact with evil forces. Those things, they're not natural." As they watched, one of the beasts, a grotesque amalgamation of bear and man, picked up an entire tree and hurled it towards the stronghold. It crashed against the outer wall, sending tremors through the structure. "Sound the alarm," Eric commanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Everyone to battle stations, archers to the walls." The stronghold erupted into frantic activity. Warriors rushed to their positions, fear evident in their eyes but determination in their stance. They had faced overwhelming odds before, but this was something else entirely. As the enemy forces advanced, led by their unnatural vanguard, Eric felt a presence beside him. He turned to see his uncle, Thorvald's estranged brother Ragnar, clad in battle gear. "I thought you had abandoned us," Eric said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Ragnar's face was grim. "I've made many mistakes, nephew, but I'm here now, to stand with my family and my clan." Before Eric could respond, a deafening roar split the air. One of the monstrous creatures had reached the outer wall, its massive claws tearing through stone as if it were parchment. "Archers!" Eirik bellowed. "Concentrate your fire on that beast." A hail of arrows descended upon the creature, but they seemed to have little effect. It continued its assault, and with a thunderous crack, a section of the outer wall collapsed. "Fall back to the inner defenses," Eric ordered, his mind racing. How could they hope to stand against such monstrosities? The battle raged on, a chaotic melee of steel, flesh, and unholy abominations. Eirik fought alongside his warriors, his sword singing a deadly song. But for every enemy they felled, two more seemed to take its place. And always, the unnatural beasts pushed forward, unstoppable and terrifying. In his chamber, Thorvald thrashed in his fever-induced delirium. Ingrid struggled to hold him down, murmuring soothing words as she applied cool cloths to his burning forehead. In his mind, Thorvald wandered through misty realms, caught between life and death. Suddenly, a figure appeared before him, a woman of otherworldly beauty, clad in shimmering armor. "Thorvald," she spoke, her voice echoing strangely. "Your people need you. You must find the strength to go on." Who are you?" Thorvald asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "I am Valkyrie, chooser of the slain," she replied. "But it is not yet your time, warrior. There is hope yet for your clan, if you have the courage to seize it." Before Thorvald could question her further, the vision shifted. He saw flashes of battles yet to come, of a hidden path through treacherous mountains, of his people finding refuge in a place of green and plenty. And through it all, a shimmering thread of hope, tenuous but unbreakable. Back on the battlefield, the situation had become dire. Half of the stronghold had fallen to the enemy's relentless assault. Eric and his remaining warriors were pushed back to the inner keep, fighting desperately for every inch. Ragnar fought like a man possessed, his axe rising and falling in deadly arcs. But even his ferocious skill couldn't stem the tide of enemies and monsters that poured through the breached defenses. As a particularly massive beast lumbered towards the keep's entrance, Ragnar made a decision. He turned to Eirik, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and resolve. "Nephew," he said, his voice barely audible over the din of battle, "tell my brother, tell Thorvald I'm sorry, for everything." Before Eric could react, Ragnar charged towards the creature, bellowing a war cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the stronghold. He leapt upon the beast, his axe finding purchase in its thick hide. "Uncle, no!" Eirik cried out, but it was too late. Ragnar and the monster grappled, tumbling towards the edge of the broken wall. With a final mighty heave, Ragnar pushed them both over the edge, plummeting to the rocks below. The beast's dying roar echoed across the battlefield, momentarily stunning both defenders and attackers. In that brief respite, Eirik saw his chance. "Everyone, fall back to the inner sanctum," he commanded. "We make our last stand there." As the remaining clan members retreated to the deepest part of the stronghold, Eirik felt a mix of emotions churning within him. Grief for his uncle's sacrifice, fear for their dire situation, and a gnawing doubt about his ability to lead them through this crisis. In his chamber, Thorvald's eyes snapped open, clarity returning to them for the first time in days. "Ingrid," he croaked, his voice weak but determined. "Help me up. My people need me." Ingrid hesitated, torn between her duty as a healer and her respect for her chieftain. "My lord, you're not yet—" "Now, Ingrid," Thorvald interrupted, already struggling to sit up. "There's no more time." As Thorvald slowly made his way towards the inner sanctum, leaning heavily on Ingrid, he could hear the sounds of battle drawing ever closer. The clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, and the inhuman roars of Gunnar's monstrous allies filled the air. When he finally reached the sanctum, the sight that greeted him was one of desperation and last-ditch courage. His people, warriors and civilians alike, stood ready to make their final stand. And at their head, looking both terrified and resolute, stood his son Eirik. "Father," Eirik exclaimed, relief evident in his voice. "You're awake." Thorvald nodded, straightening up despite the pain that lanced through him. "Aye, my son, and not a moment too soon, it seems." He looked around at the battered but unbroken faces of his clan. "My people," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We stand now at our darkest hour. But remember this, it is always darkest before the dawn." A murmur went through the assembled clan members, hope kindling in their eyes at the sight of their leader. "I have seen a vision," Thorvald continued. "A path to survival, to a new home where our people can thrive. But to reach it, we must first survive this night. Can I count on you, one last time, to stand against the darkness?" A resounding cheer went up, weapons raised in salute. The clan's spirit, so close to breaking, had been rekindled by their chieftain's words. As the sounds of the enemy's approach grew louder, Thorvald turned to Eirik. "You've done well, my son. Now let us face this threat together as father and son, as chieftain and heir, as one clan united against all odds." Eirik nodded, standing tall beside his father. Together they faced the entrance to the sanctum, ready to meet whatever horrors Gunnar's forces would unleash upon them. The door shuddered under the impact of something massive. Once, twice, 3 times it held. But on the 4th thunderous blow, it began to splinter. Thorvald raised his sword, ignoring the pain that screamed through his body. "For our clan," he roared. "For our future." As the door finally gave way and the enemy poured in, Thorvald and his people met them with a fury born of desperation and hope. The first light of dawn crept through the narrow windows of the inner sanctum, casting long shadows across the weary faces of Thorvald's clan. The night had been long and brutal, with wave after wave of Gunnar's forces crashing against their last defenses. Somehow they had held, but at a terrible cost. The floor was slick with blood, and the air heavy with the moans of the wounded. Thorvald stood at the center of it all, his imposing figure a beacon of strength despite his own injuries. The fever that had nearly claimed him had broken during the night, leaving him with a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in days. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the battered but unbroken spirits of his people. "Gather round," he called, his voice rough but commanding. "I have something to tell you all." Slowly, those who could still stand formed a circle around their chieftain. Eirik, his face streaked with dirt and blood, stood at his father's right hand. Thorvald took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in his side. "My people, you have fought with valor beyond measure. but our situation remains dire. Gunnar's forces still outnumber us, and those abominations he commands cannot be defeated by steel alone. A murmur of unease rippled through the gathered clan members. They had all seen the nightmare creatures that now prowled outside their walls. However, Thorvald continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, there is a way out. A path known only to the clan's elders passed down through generations. It was to be used only in our darkest hour, and that hour is upon us. Gasps and whispers erupted among the crowd. Eric turned to his father, his eyes wide with surprise. A secret path? Father, why didn't you mention this before? Thorvald placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Because, my boy, it was a closely guarded secret. To speak of it before absolute necessity would risk its discovery. But now, it may be our only hope for survival. He turned back to address the clan. The path leads through hidden caves beneath the stronghold, eventually emerging in the high mountains to the north. It's treacherous and narrow, but it will allow us to slip past Gunnar's forces undetected. Hope began to dawn on the faces around him, but it was quickly tempered by reality. Astrid, the eldest of the clan, spoke up. But chieftain, how can we evacuate without Gunnar noticing? His beasts will surely smell us out. Thorvald nodded grimly. You're right, Astrid. That's why we must maintain the illusion of defense even as we evacuate. A small group of volunteers will stay behind to man the walls and keep up appearances. The implications of his words sank in, and a heavy silence fell over the room. To stay behind would mean certain death. Before anyone could speak, Eric stepped forward. I will lead the volunteers, Father. It's my duty as your heir to ensure the safety of our people. Thorvald's heart swelled with pride even as fear gripped it. No, my son. Your place is with our people, leading them to safety. I will stay behind. Protests immediately erupted, but Thorvald raised his hand for silence. This is not open for discussion. As your chieftain, it is my responsibility to ensure the survival of our clan. Eirik, you will lead our people through the hidden path. I will remain here with the volunteers to buy you time. Tears welled up in Eric's eyes, but he nodded, understanding the weight of his father's decision. I understand, Father. I won't let you down. Thorvald pulled his son into a fierce embrace. You never have, my boy, and you never will. Breaking away, Thorvald began issuing orders. We move quickly. Gather only what you can carry. The wounded who can't walk will be carried. Ingrid, prepare what medicines you can. We don't know how long the journey will take. The clan sprang into action, a new energy infusing their movements. Hope, no matter how slim, was a powerful motivator. As preparations were made, Thorvald pulled aside a group of his most trusted warriors. You know what I'm going to ask, he said, his voice low. Bjorn, his oldest friend, nodded solemnly. We'll stand with you, chieftain. To the end. Thorvald clasped each of their arms in turn. Thank you, my friends. Our sacrifice will ensure the survival of our people. As the clan prepared for the evacuation, Thorvald led a small group to a hidden chamber deep within the stronghold. There, behind an ancient tapestry depicting the clan's history, lay a narrow opening. This is the entrance to the hidden path, Thorvald explained. It will be a hard journey, but it's our only chance. Eric examined the opening, a mix of awe and trepidation on his face. How long has this been here, Father? Since the stronghold was built, Thorvald replied. Our ancestors knew that one day we might face a threat too great to overcome by force alone. They prepared this escape route, hoping it would never be needed. As they returned to the main chamber, the sounds of renewed assault echoed from above. Gunnar's forces, having rested through the night, were beginning their attack anew. We're out of time, Thorvald announced. Begin the evacuation now. Remember, absolute silence is crucial. One wrong sound could give us away. The clan began to file into the hidden passage, each person carrying what little they could. Children were hushed. Wounds were tightly bound to prevent dripping blood. and every step was taken with utmost care. Thorvald stood at the entrance, watching as his people disappeared into the darkness. Each face that passed him might be the last time he ever saw them. His heart ached, but he knew this was the only way. Eric was the last to enter. He turned to his father, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Father, I don't know if I can do this without you." Thorvald cupped his son's face in his hands. "You can, and you will. You are stronger than you know, Eric. Lead our people to safety, find a new home and rebuild. That is your destiny." "But what about you?" Eric whispered. Thorvald smiled sadly. "My story ends here, son. But through you, through our people, it will live on. Now go before it's too late." With a final, crushing embrace, Eric turned and entered the passage. Thorvald watched until the last flicker of torchlight disappeared into the darkness. Then, with a heavy heart, he sealed the entrance, hiding it once more behind the ancient tapestry. Above, the sounds of battle grew louder. Thorvald made his way back to the main hall, where his small band of volunteers waited. "Well, my friends," he said, hefting his sword, "shall we give Gunnar a welcome he'll never forget?" With grim smiles, they followed their chieftain up to the walls. The morning sun was now fully risen, illuminating the sea of enemies that surrounded them. Among the human warriors, the monstrous forms of Gunnar's unnatural allies loomed. Thorvald raised his sword high, letting out a battle cry that echoed across the battlefield. "Come then, Gunnar," he roared. "Come and test yourself against the last of the Northmen." As Gunnar's forces surged forward, Thorvald allowed himself one last glance back towards the hidden passage. In his mind's eye, he could see Eric leading their people through the dark caves towards a future full of hope and possibility. "May the gods watch over you," he whispered. Then, with a fierce grin, he turned to face the oncoming horde. His story might be ending, but he would ensure it ended in a way worthy of the sagas. As steel met steel and the final battle for the stronghold began, deep below, the clan of the Bear made their way through ancient tunnels. They carried with them not just their meager possessions, but the weight of their history and the hope for their future. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but they moved forward, driven by the sacrifice of those they left behind. In the darkness of the caves, Eric felt the mantle of leadership settle heavily upon his shoulders. He thought of his father standing tall against impossible odds, buying them this chance with his very life. Silently, he vowed to be worthy of that sacrifice. "Forward," he whispered to those nearest him. "We move forward for those we've lost, and for all that is yet to come." And so, as battle raged above, the clan began their journey into the unknown, carrying with them the indomitable spirit of their people and the legacy of a chieftain who gave everything for their. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays glinting off the snow-covered battlefield surrounding the battered stronghold. Inside, Thorvald and his small band of warriors prepared for what they knew would be their final battle. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the sound of weapons being sharpened and armor being adjusted. Thorvald stood at the center of the great hall, his eyes roaming over the faces of those who had chosen to stay behind. Each one of them knew the price they would pay, yet there was no fear in their eyes, only grim determination. "My friends," Thorvald began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room, "I won't lie to you. What we face today is certain death, but our deaths will have meaning. Every moment we hold out is another moment our people have to escape, to find safety." Bjorn, his oldest friend and most trusted warrior, stepped forward. "It has been an honor to fight by your side all these years, Thorvald. There's no place I'd rather be than here, making our last stand together." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the small group. Thorvald felt a swell of pride and sorrow in his chest. These were the best of his people, willing to lay down their lives without hesitation. "We may fall today," Thorvald continued, "but our names will live on in the sagas. Our people will sing of this day for generations to come. Let us make sure they have a tale worth singing." A cheer went up, weapons raised in salute. As if in response, a horn blast sounded from outside, the signal for the enemy's advance. Thorvald raised his hand for silence. "To your positions, and may the gods be with us all." The warriors dispersed, taking up their assigned posts along the walls and at key points within the stronghold. Thorvald made his way to the main gate, Bjorn at his side. "Do you think they made it?" Bjorn asked quietly, referring to the escaped clan members. Thorvald nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon where dust clouds signaled the approaching enemy. "Eric will see them safely through. We just need to buy them enough time." As they watched, the first wave of Gunnar's forces came into view. Hundreds of warriors, their armor glinting in the sunlight, advanced towards the stronghold. Behind them loomed the monstrous shapes of the unnatural beasts Gunnar had somehow acquired. "Archers!" Thorvald bellowed. "Make every arrow count!" A hail of arrows arced from the walls, finding their marks among the approaching enemy. Men fell, but for each one that dropped, two more seemed to take their place. The battle was joined in earnest as the first of the enemy forces reached the walls. Ladders were raised, grappling hooks thrown. Thorvald's warriors fought with the desperate energy of men who knew they were already dead, each determined to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. Thorvald was everywhere at once, his sword a blur of motion as he cut down foe after foe. His voice rang out over the din of battle, encouraging his men, directing their efforts. Hours seemed to pass in the blink of an eye. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its descent, the snow-covered ground now stained red with blood. The defenders had exacted a heavy toll, but their numbers dwindled with each passing moment. As Thorvald cut down yet another attacker, he caught sight of a figure striding through the melee. Tall and broad-shouldered, clad in black armor adorned with the pelt of a massive bear, there was no mistaking who it was. "Gunnar!" Thorvald roared, his voice carrying across the battlefield. The enemy commander turned, his eyes locking with Thorvald's. A cruel smile spread across his face as he began to make his way towards the chieftain, cutting down any who stood in his path. Bjorn appeared at Thorvald's side, breathing heavily and bleeding from several wounds. "Let me take him, old friend. You're needed elsewhere." Thorvald clasped Bjorn's shoulder. "No, this is my fight. See to the others. Make sure every one of these bastards pays dearly for our lives." Bjorn hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "It has been an honor, Thorvald. I'll see you in Valhalla." As Bjorn moved away, Thorvald and Gunnar finally stood face to face. The sounds of battle seemed to fade away as the two leaders regarded each other. "So, the mighty Thorvald makes his last stand," Gunnar sneered. "I expected more from you. Where is your vaunted clan? Have they abandoned you to die alone?" Thorvald's grip tightened on his sword. "My people are beyond your reach, Gunnar. All you'll find here is your doom." With a roar of rage, Gunnar attacked. His massive warhammer whistled through the air, narrowly missing Thorvald's head as the chieftain ducked and rolled. The duel that followed was epic in its ferocity. Gunnar's brute strength was matched against Thorvald's skill and experience. They traded blows, each searching for an opening, each knowing that a single mistake would mean death. Around them, the battle continued to rage. Thorvald caught glimpses of his warriors falling one by one, each taking multiple enemies with them. Bjorn's voice could be heard, growing hoarser but no less defiant as he rallied the remaining defenders. Thorvald's arms burned with fatigue, his wounds slowing him. But he fought on, driven by the knowledge that every moment he kept Gunnar occupied was another moment his people had to escape. Finally, Gunnar's hammer found its mark. The blow caught Thorvald in the side, sending him sprawling. He could feel ribs crack, taste blood in his mouth, but even as he fell, his sword lashed out, opening a deep gash across Gunnar's thigh. Both leaders staggered back, breathing heavily. Gunnar leaned on his hammer, his leg barely supporting his weight. Thorvald struggled to his feet, using his sword as a crutch. "It seems we're both at our limit," Gunnar panted. "But I still have an army. You have nothing left, Thorvald. Surrender now, tell me where your people have fled, and I'll grant you a clean death. Thorvald spat blood onto the snow. My people are gone, Gunnar. You've lost. All you've won here is a pile of rocks and corpses. Rage contorted Gunnar's features. With a bellow of fury, he charged at Thorvald, his hammer raised high. Time seemed to slow for Thorvald. He saw Gunnar approaching, saw the hammer beginning its deadly arc. He knew he didn't have the strength left to dodge, but in that moment, he also knew what he had to do. As the hammer descended, Thorvald lunged forward. The weapon crashed into his shoulder, shattering bone and sending waves of agony through his body. But the move brought him inside Gunnar's guard. With the last of his strength, Thorvald drove his sword up and into Gunnar's chest. The two leaders stood there, locked together in their final embrace. Gunnar's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. He opened his mouth, but only blood came out. Then, slowly, he toppled backwards, Thorvald's sword still buried in his heart. Thorvald fell to his knees, his vision blurring. The sounds of battle were fading, whether from the fighting dying down or his own fading senses, he couldn't tell. With tremendous effort, he raised his head. The courtyard was littered with bodies, many more of the enemy than of his own warriors. He caught sight of Bjorn surrounded by a ring of fallen foes, his axe still gripped tightly in his lifeless hands. Well done, old friend, Thorvald murmured. His gaze drifted to the mountains in the distance where he knew his people were making their escape. A sense of peace washed over him. They were safe. His clan would live on. With the last of his strength ebbing away, Thorvald managed to struggle to his feet. He retrieved his sword from Gunnar's corpse, ignoring the flares of pain from his shattered body. Leaning heavily on the weapon, he turned to face the remaining enemy forces. They hesitated, these men who had seen their seemingly invincible leader fall. Thorvald stood before them, bloodied and broken, yet somehow still defiant. "Come then," he roared, his voice carrying across the battlefield one last time. "Come and meet your doom." And as the enemy surged forward, as his vision began to darken, Thorvald allowed himself a small smile. He had lived as a warrior, and he would die as one. His people were safe, and his name would live on in their songs and stories. With his final breath, Thorvald raised his sword and charged into the enemy ranks. He was Thorvald, chieftain of the Bear clan, and this was his last stand. The once pristine snow that blanketed the battlefield now bore witness to the carnage that had unfolded. Crimson stains spread like a macabre tapestry, telling the tale of the fierce battle that had raged for hours. Bodies of friend and foe alike lay strewn across the ground, their final resting place a testament to the brutality of war. In the midst of this sea of death stood Thorvald, the last defender of the stronghold. His once gleaming armor was now dented and splattered with blood, his own mingling with that of his enemies. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the cold air as he surveyed the scene around him. The remaining enemy forces had formed a wide circle around him, wary of approaching the man who had single-handedly slain their leader and countless of their comrades. Thorvald could see the fear in their eyes, mixed with a grudging respect for his seemingly supernatural endurance. As he stood there, surrounded by foes, Thorvald's mind drifted to the path that had led him to this moment. He saw flashes of his life, his father teaching him to wield a sword, his wedding day, the birth of his sons, countless battles fought and won. Each memory was a spark of warmth in the cold reality of his impending doom. "It's been quite a life," he murmured to himself, a wry smile tugging at his bloodied lips. His thoughts then turned to his clan, to Eric, leading them through the secret passage to safety. He imagined them emerging from the mountains, finding a new home, rebuilding their lives. The image filled him with a sense of peace and purpose. "Your sacrifices will not be in vain," he whispered to the fallen around him. "Our people will live on." One of the enemy warriors, bolder than the rest, stepped forward. "Surrender, old man," he called out, his voice betraying a mix of fear and awe. "You've fought well, but it's over now. die with dignity. Thorvald's laugh was a harsh, grating sound. Surrender? I don't think you understand, boy. This isn't about surviving. This is about how many more of you I can take with me before I fall. The warrior took a step back, unnerved by the fierce determination in Thorvald's eyes. Thorvald raised his sword, ignoring the screaming pain in his battered body. Come then. Who wants to be the first to meet their gods? For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if a dam had broken, they charged en masse. What happened next would be spoken of in hushed whispers around campfires for generations to come. Thorvald, a man who by all rights should have collapsed from his wounds long ago, fought with a strength that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. His sword became a blur of motion, cutting down foes with every swing. He moved with a speed that belied his size and injuries, ducking and weaving through the press of bodies. Blood sprayed with each strike, adding fresh stains to the already crimson snow. For the clan, Thorvald roared as he fought, his voice carrying across the battlefield. For our future. Enemy warriors fell before him like wheat before a scythe. Those on the outer edges of the melee began to falter, some even turning to flee from this seemingly invincible opponent. But even Thorvald's superhuman strength had its limits. Gradually, his movements began to slow. Wounds that he had been ignoring through sheer force of will started to take their toll, yet still he fought on. Each fallen enemy another moment bought for his escaping people. As he cut down yet another foe, Thorvald's gaze was drawn to the distant mountains. There, barely visible in the fading light, he caught a glimpse of movement, a line of figures making their way up a hidden path. They made it, he breathed, a smile of pure joy breaking through the grimace of pain on his face. In that moment of distraction, an enemy blade found its mark. Thorvald staggered, feeling the cold bite of steel sliding between his ribs. He turned, his sword lashing out one final time to fell his attacker. Then slowly, inexorably, Thorvald began to fall. The sounds of battle faded away, replaced by a strange, peaceful quiet. As he collapsed to his knees, his gaze remained fixed on those distant figures, now disappearing over the crest of the mountain. Live well, my people, he whispered. Build a new home. Tell our stories. Remember. With those final words, Thorvald, last chieftain of the Bear clan, fell forward into the blood-soaked snow. His eyes, still open, reflected the last light of the setting sun. The remaining enemy warriors approached cautiously, still wary of some final trick. But as they surrounded the fallen chieftain, it became clear that the battle was truly over. One of them, a grizzled veteran, knelt beside Thorvald's body. By the gods, he muttered. I've never seen anything like it. One man against an army. Another warrior spat on the ground. He was no man. He fought like a demon possessed. The veteran shook his head. No, not a demon. A hero. The kind they write sagas about. A young warrior, barely more than a boy, looked towards the mountains where Thorvald had been gazing in his final moments. Do you think some of them escaped? The veteran followed his gaze, then looked back at Thorvald's body. He saw the smile on the fallen chieftain's face, the look of triumph in his unseeing eyes. Aye, lad, I think they did. And I think that's exactly what he wanted. As the enemy forces began the grim task of gathering their dead, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The snow, stained red with the blood of hundreds, began to glitter in the fading light, as if the very earth was paying tribute to the fallen. In the distance, hidden from view, Eric led the remnants of the Bear clan through treacherous mountain passes. He paused for a moment, looking back towards the stronghold that had been their home for generations. Though he couldn't see it, he felt a pang in his heart, knowing that his father and the brave warriors who had stayed behind were now gone. Father, he whispered into the wind, I swear by all the gods, your sacrifice will not be in vain. We will find a new home. We will rebuild, and we will never forget. As night fell, the battlefield grew still. The bodies of the fallen lay where they had dropped, friend and foe alike united in death. And at the center of it all lay Thorvald, surrounded by the enemies he had slain in his final stand. In the years to come, tales would be told of this day, of how one man had stood against an army, of how he had fought with the strength of 10 men to protect his people. The story would grow in the telling, becoming legend, then myth. But the truth, as is often the case, was both simpler and more profound than the legends. It was the story of a leader who loved his people so much that he willingly gave his life for them, of a father who ensured his children would have a future, even at the cost of his own, of a man who in his final moments found peace in the knowledge that his life had meaning. As the moon rose over the blood-stained battlefield, it illuminated the face of the fallen chieftain, and there, etched in the lines of that weathered face, was a smile. For Thorvald, son of the North, chieftain of the Bear clan, had died as he had lived, protecting his people, ensuring their future, and carving his name into the annals of history with blade and blood. His was a legacy written not in gold or stone, but in the very lifeblood of his people, a legacy that would endure long after the snow had covered the scars of battle, long after his name had faded from memory. For in the survival of his clan, in the future he had bought with his life, Thorvald had achieved a kind of immortality that few ever attain. And so, as the night deepened and stars appeared in the sky, the battlefield fell silent. But somewhere in the mountains, a group of survivors pressed on, carrying with them the hope, the strength, and the indomitable spirit of their fallen chieftain. Thorvald's fight was over, but his legacy was just beginning. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale light on the devastated landscape surrounding the once mighty stronghold. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Gunnar's forces, victorious but at a terrible cost, began to withdraw from the ruins. A grizzled warrior, his armor dented and splattered with dried blood, approached his commander. "Sir, we've secured the stronghold. There's no sign of any survivors." The commander, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, nodded grimly. "And what of their leader, the one they call Thorvald?" "Dead, sir. We found his body in the courtyard, surrounded by dozens of our fallen. He took down many of our best men before he fell." The commander's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the battlefield. "Such a waste," he muttered. "Gather our dead." We returned to Gunnar with news of our Pyrrhic victory. As the enemy forces began their slow retreat, leaving behind a landscape forever scarred by battle, far to the north, a very different scene was unfolding. Eirik, son of Thorvald, stood at the entrance of a hidden valley, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Behind him, the remnants of the Bear clan, women, children, and the few warriors who had escaped, waited with bated breath. Astrid, the clan's eldest, approached Eirik. Her face was lined with exhaustion and grief, but her eyes held a spark of hope. "What do you see, my boy?" Eirik shook his head. "Nothing. No sign of Gunnar's forces. I think we've truly escaped." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the gathered clan members. Eirik turned to face his people, acutely aware of the weight of leadership that now rested on his shoulders. "My friends, my family," he began, his voice carrying across the valley. "We have endured great hardship and suffered terrible losses, but we are here, we are alive, and we are free." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him, faces etched with grief, exhaustion, and tentative hope. "My father, our chieftain Thorvald, gave his life so that we might have this chance. We cannot, we will not, squander his sacrifice. This valley will be our new home. Here, we will rebuild. Here, we will honor those we've lost by living, by thriving." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eirik saw nods of determination, saw backs straighten and chins lift. These were his father's people, resilient, strong, unbreakable. As the clan began to set up camp and explore their new sanctuary, tales of Thorvald's last stand began to circulate. Warriors who had witnessed his final battle spoke in hushed, awe-filled tones of his incredible feat. "I saw him take down 10 men with a single sweep of his sword," one young warrior claimed, his eyes wide with wonder. An older warrior scoffed. 10? I saw him fell 20 with one blow. And when Gunnar himself faced him, Thorvald fought like a man possessed by the gods themselves. Astrid listened to these tales with a mixture of sorrow and pride. She approached the gathering, her presence immediately commanding respect and attention. "Our Thorvald was indeed a great warrior," she said, her voice soft but carrying. "But his true strength lay not in his sword arm, but in his heart. He fought not for glory but for us, for our survival, for our future. Let us honor him not just by telling tales of his prowess in battle, but by living as he taught us, with courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to our people." Her words struck a chord with the clan. As the days passed and they began to establish their new home, Thorvald's legacy became more than just stories of his final battle. It became a guiding principle, a standard to which they all aspired. Word of Thorvald's heroic last stand spread beyond the clan. Travelers passing through nearby settlements spoke of the chieftain who had faced down an army, of the clan that had vanished into the mountains. These tales grew in the telling, becoming legend. In taverns and around campfires, people whispered of the Bear clan and their indomitable leader. For those chafing under Gunnar's harsh rule, these stories became a spark of hope, a reminder that resistance was possible. One evening, as Eric sat with the clan elders discussing plans for their growing settlement, a scout burst into the meeting, breathless with excitement. "Chieftain, visitors approaching from the east." Eric was on his feet in an instant, hand going to his sword. "Enemies?" The scout shook his head. "No, sir, they carry no weapons. They say they've come to join us." Astrid's eyes widened. "Join us? How did they even find us?" Eric, accompanied by his most trusted warriors, went to meet the newcomers. To his surprise, he found a group of families, men, women, and children, their faces haggard from travel, but alight with hope. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, stepped forward. "Are you Eric, son of Thorvald?" Eric nodded cautiously. "I am." "Who are you, and how did you find us?" The man smiled. "My name is Halvor. We've traveled far, following rumors and whispers. Tales are spreading of your father's stand against Gunnar, of a clan that escaped to build a new life free from tyranny. We want to be part of that, if you'll have us." Eric was stunned. He looked at the hopeful faces before him, then back at his own people. He saw the same hope reflected in their eyes. After a moment of contemplation, Eric extended his hand to Halvor. "If you're willing to work hard and abide by our ways, you're welcome here. My father believed in building a future for all who sought it. We'll honor his memory by continuing that tradition." As spring began to thaw the winter's grip on the land, the hidden valley buzzed with activity. New homes were built, fields were plowed, and the sounds of laughter and life echoed through the air. The Bear clan, bolstered by newcomers drawn to their growing legend, was not just surviving, it was thriving. Eirik stood on a hill overlooking the settlement, marveling at how much they had accomplished in such a short time. Astrid joined him, leaning on her staff as she gazed out at the bustling scene below. "Your father would be proud," she said softly. "You've led us well, Eric." Eric smiled, though his eyes held a hint of sadness. "I hope so. I just wish he could see this." Astrid patted his arm. "He sees, my boy. In every free person down there, in every child born into freedom, Thorvald's spirit lives on." As they stood there, a messenger approached, out of breath from his climb. "Chieftain, news from the south." Eric turned, eyebrow raised. "What news?" The messenger's eyes shone with excitement. "Rebellion, sir. The stories of your father's stand have spread far and wide. People are rising up against Gunnar's rule. They're calling for freedom, inspired by the tale of the Bear clan." Eric's heart raced at the news. He looked out over the valley again, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a refuge, it was the beginning of something much larger. "Gather the clan," he told the messenger. "It's time we discussed our next steps. My father gave his life to secure our freedom. Now it's our turn to help others secure theirs." As Eric descended the hill to address his people, his mind whirled with possibilities. The legacy of Thorvald was growing beyond anything they could have imagined, becoming a beacon of hope for all who yearned for freedom. Meanwhile, far to the south, on the battlefield where Thorvald had made his last stand, something miraculous was occurring. As the spring sun warmed the blood-soaked earth, the first flowers began to bloom. Delicate white blossoms pushed through the soil, their petals unmarred by the carnage that had taken place there. A traveler, passing by the ruined stronghold, paused at the sight. He knelt, gently touching one of the flowers, a sense of awe washing over him. "By the gods," he whispered, "life finds a way, even here." As he stood and continued his journey, the traveler couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something profound. He didn't know the full story of what had happened on that battlefield, but he sensed that it was a place of both great sorrow and great hope. And so, as the flowers continued to bloom on Thorvald's battlefield, and his clan flourished in their new home, the dawn of a new era truly began. An era born from sacrifice and courage, nurtured by hope and determination, and destined to change the course of history for generations to come. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked battlefield. Asger stood atop a small hill, his armor dented and stained, surveying the carnage before him. The air was thick with the stench of death and the metallic tang of spilled blood. Fires flickered in the distance, illuminating the broken bodies of friend and foe alike. Asger's weathered face bore the weight of countless battles, his eyes reflecting the toll of war. He ran a calloused hand through his graying hair, exhaling deeply. The warrior's gaze swept over the field, taking in the magnitude of loss on both sides. "How many more must fall before this madness ends?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible above the moans of the wounded and dying. As he stood there, wrestling with the enormity of the situation, a plan began to form in his mind. It was risky, perhaps even foolish, but it offered a chance to end the bloodshed without further decimating both armies. Asger turned to his second-in-command, Bjorn, who stood silently nearby. "Gather the war council," he ordered, his voice firm with resolve. "I have a proposition to make." Bjorn nodded, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "At once, my lord." Within the hour, Asger found himself standing before his most trusted advisors and generals in the command tent. Maps and battle plans were strewn across a large oak table, illuminated by the warm glow of candlelight. The faces that looked back at him were a mixture of exhaustion and grim determination. Asger placed both hands on the table, leaning forward. "We cannot continue like this," he began, his voice low but commanding. "Each day brings more death, more destruction. Our people suffer, our lands burn, and for what? A war that seems without end?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled leaders. Asger continued, "I propose a solution, one that may seem unorthodox, perhaps even desperate. But desperate times call for bold action." He paused, meeting the eyes of each person in the tent. "I will challenge their leader, Ragnar the Merciless, to single combat. A duel to decide the fate of this war." The tent erupted into a cacophony of voices. Some expressed support, others vehement disagreement. Bjorn raised his hand, silencing the council. "My lord," he said, his brow furrowed with concern, "while your courage is admirable, this is a great risk. Ragnar is known for his skill in battle and his lack of honor. How can we trust him to abide by the terms of such a duel?" Asger nodded, acknowledging the valid point. "You're right to be cautious, Bjorn. But consider this. Ragnar's army is as weary as ours. His supplies must be running low. A chance to end this war with a single combat may appeal to his ego and his practical needs." Lydia, the chief strategist, spoke up. "And what of the terms, my lord?" What do we stand to gain or lose in this gamble? Asger's eyes blazed with determination. Everything. If I win, Ragnar's forces withdraw completely from our lands. If I fall... He paused, the weight of his next words hanging in the air. If I fall, I offer myself as the sacrifice to spare our people. I will surrender myself to Ragnar, and our army will stand down. The tent fell silent, the magnitude of Asger's proposal sinking in. It was Bjorn who finally broke the silence. My lord, you cannot mean to... Asger cut him off with a raised hand. I do, old friend. The lives of our people are worth more than my own. This is the best chance we have to end this war without further bloodshed. The War Council debated long into the night. Arguments were made for and against the plan. Strategies were proposed and discarded. Through it all, Asger stood firm in his resolve. As the first light of dawn began to creep into the tent, a consensus was finally reached. With the decision made, Asger retreated to his private quarters to prepare. He sat before a small fire, his legendary sword laid across his lap. The blade gleamed in the firelight as he carefully honed its edge, each stroke of the whetstone deliberate and focused. As he worked, Asger's mind wandered to the battles that had led to this moment. The faces of those he had lost. The weight of the decisions that had brought him here. He thought of his home, of the peaceful fields and bustling villages now threatened by war. It was for them that he would fight this duel, for a chance at peace. A soft knock at the tent flap interrupted his reverie. Enter, Asger called out, not looking up from his task. Bjorn stepped inside, his face etched with concern. The preparations are complete, my lord. The messenger awaits your word to deliver the challenge to Ragnar's camp. Asger nodded, finally looking up from his sword. Thank you, Bjorn. Send him forth with all haste. Let us hope Ragnar has the wisdom to accept. Bjorn hesitated, then spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. Asger, I've followed you into countless battles. I've never questioned your judgment, but this... Are you certain this is the only way? Asger stood, sheathing his sword with a metallic hiss. He placed a hand on Bjorn's shoulder, meeting his old friend's gaze. It may not be the only way, but it is the right way. Too much blood has been spilled already. If I can end this war with a single combat, then my life is a small price to pay. Bjorn nodded, understanding and respect evident in his eyes. Then may the gods favor your blade, my friend. We'll be with you, whatever comes. As Bjorn left to dispatch the messenger, Asger turned to gaze out of his tent. The camp was stirring to life, soldiers preparing for another day of battle, unaware of the challenge about to be issued. Asger's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, his mind already turning to the duel to come. The messenger, a young soldier named Eric, approached Asger for final instructions. My lord, he said, bowing slightly, I am ready to deliver your challenge. Is there anything specific you wish me to convey to Ragnar? Asger considered for a moment, then spoke. Tell him this. Ragnar the Merciless, I, Asger Ironheart, challenge you to single combat. Let us end this war as it began, with the clash of steel between leaders. Meet me on the field at midnight when the moon is highest. The fate of our people will be decided by our blades. Eric repeated the message, committing it to memory. With a nod from Asger, he mounted his horse and rode off towards the enemy camp, a white flag of truce fluttering above him. As the messenger disappeared into the distance, Asger turned back to his preparations. He donned his armor piece by piece, each plate a reminder of the battles that had brought him to this moment. As he worked, he muttered a prayer to the gods, not for victory, but for the strength to do what was necessary for his people. The camp buzzed with anticipation as word of the challenge spread. Soldiers gathered in small groups discussing the possible outcomes in hushed tones. Some expressed awe at their leader's bravery, while others worried about the consequences of failure. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the battlefield, Asger emerged from his tent fully armored. He walked through the camp, stopping to speak with his soldiers, offering words of encouragement and resolve. His presence brought a sense of calm to the anxious troops, their faith in their leader evident in their eyes. Finally, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Asger made his way to the edge of the camp. He stood there, his sword gleaming under the rising moon, waiting for the response to his challenge. The fate of 2 armies, of entire kingdoms, hung in the balance. In the enemy camp, Ragnar the Merciless sat in his ornate tent, his scarred face illuminated by flickering torchlight. The messenger, Eric, knelt before him, having just delivered Asger's challenge. Ragnar's dark eyes narrowed as he contemplated the words. "So," Ragnar growled, his voice like gravel, "the Honorable Asger Ironheart wishes to settle this with single combat." He laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound that made Eric flinch. How predictable. Ragnar's advisors exchanged uneasy glances. One, a thin man with a hawk-like nose, spoke up. "My lord, this could be a trap. We shouldn't—" "Silence!" Ragnar roared, silencing the man with a glare. He turned his attention back to Eric. "Tell your master I accept his challenge. I look forward to adding his head to my collection." As Eric was escorted out of the camp, Ragnar's mind raced with possibilities. This duel could end the war in one stroke, saving him the resources of a prolonged campaign. But more than that, it offered him the chance to crush Asger personally, to break the spirit of the enemy by defeating their legendary leader. "Prepare my armor," Ragnar ordered, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Tomorrow night, we end this war." Meanwhile, in Asger's camp, the warrior tossed and turned on his simple cot, sleep eluding him. Every time he closed his eyes, visions of past battles flooded his mind. He saw the faces of friends lost, heard the screams of the dying, felt the weight of every life he had taken. One memory in particular haunted him: the Battle of Ravenswood, where he had led a charge that turned the tide of the fight, but cost the lives of many young soldiers. He remembered the eyes of a boy no more than 16 as life slipped away from him. Asger sat up, rubbing his face with calloused hands. "Gods give me strength," he muttered, reaching for a flask of water. As he sipped the cool liquid, his tent flap opened and Bjorn entered. The old warrior's face was etched with concern. "Can't sleep either, my friend?" Bjorn asked, settling onto a stool. Asger shook his head. "Too many ghosts, Bjorn. Too many faces." Bjorn nodded in understanding. "The price of leadership, I'm afraid. But it's those faces that drive us to end this war, isn't it?" "Aye," Asger agreed, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. "And tomorrow, one way or another, it ends." As the 2 old friends sat in companionable silence, the camp outside buzzed with activity. Word of the impending duel had spread like wildfire, and soldiers gathered in small groups, discussing the possibilities in hushed tones. "Do you think he can win?" a young soldier asked his companion, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. The older warrior shrugged. "If anyone can, it's Asger. But Ragnar, they don't call him the Merciless for nothing." Similar conversations echoed throughout the camp, a mix of anticipation and dread hanging in the air. Some soldiers prayed to their gods, others sharpened their weapons, preparing for whatever outcome the duel might bring. As the night wore on, Lydia, Asger's chief strategist, approached his tent. She found Asger and Bjorn poring over maps, discussing potential outcomes. "My lord," Lydia said, her voice tight with concern, "I've been analyzing Ragnar's fighting style. His reputation for brutality is well earned. Are you certain about this course of action?" Asger looked up, his eyes tired but determined. "I appreciate your concern, Lydia, but this is our best chance to end the bloodshed. Sometimes a leader must take risks for the good of his people." Lydia nodded, respect evident in her eyes. "Then let us hope the gods favor the righteous, my lord." As Lydia left, Bjorn turned to Asger, his face grave. "Asger, old friend, I must speak my mind. This duel, it's too dangerous. Ragnar is known for his treachery. What if he doesn't fight fair?" Asger sighed, placing a hand on Bjorn's shoulder. "I understand your fears, Bjorn, But what choice do we have? Our people suffer, our resources dwindle. This war must end, and if my life is the price, so be it. Bjorn's eyes glistened with unshed tears. You've always been too noble for your own good, you stubborn old fool. Promise me you'll fight with everything you have. Promise me you'll come back. Asger smiled, a rare sight in recent days. I promise to fight with all my heart, old friend. As for coming back, that's in the hands of the gods now. The two warriors embraced, years of shared battles and hardships passing between them in that moment. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, both camps stirred to life. In Asger's tent, the leader donned his armor with practiced precision, each piece a familiar weight. His sword, polished and sharpened, gleamed in the early morning light. Across the battlefield, Ragnar too prepared for the duel. His armor was darker, adorned with spikes and grim trophies from past victories. He tested the edge of his massive battle axe, a wicked grin spreading across his face. The two armies began to form up on either side of the chosen dueling ground, a relatively flat area between the camps. Tensions were high, with many soldiers gripping their weapons tightly, ready for any sign of treachery. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, casting long shadows across the field, Asger emerged from his tent. His armor shone in the morning light, his cape billowing behind him. A hush fell over his troops as he walked through their ranks, nodding to familiar faces offering words of encouragement. On the opposite side, Ragnar strode out, his presence commanding and terrifying. His troops cheered and banged their weapons against their shields, a cacophony of bloodlust and anticipation. The two leaders approached the center of the field, their steps measured and deliberate. As they drew near, the differences between them became stark. Asger, though battle-hardened, carried himself with dignity and purpose. Ragnar exuded an aura of menace, his eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation. They stopped a few paces apart, sizing each other up. The fate of two armies, of entire kingdoms, hung in the balance of this moment. Asger spoke first, his voice carrying across the silent battlefield. Ragnar the Merciless, I thank you for accepting this challenge. Let us end this war, here and now, without further bloodshed of our people. Ragnar's laugh was like the growl of a beast. Noble words, Asger Ironheart, but words won't save you from my axe. Prepare yourself, for today, your legend ends. As the two leaders took their positions, tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Soldiers on both sides held their breath, knowing they were about to witness a clash that would be remembered for generations. Asger raised his sword, its polished surface catching the morning light. Ragnar hefted his massive axe, its wicked edge promising a brutal end. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The entire world focused on these two figures. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground, Ragnar charged forward, his axe arcing through the air towards Asger's head. The duel that would decide the fate of nations had begun. The air crackled with tension as Ragnar's axe whistled through the air, aimed at Asger's head. With reflexes honed by years of battle, Asger brought his sword up in a swift arc, deflecting the brutal blow with a resounding clang that echoed across the battlefield. The force of the impact sent vibrations down Asger's arm, but he held firm. Ragnar's eyes widened in surprise, clearly not expecting such a deft defense. Asger seized the moment, stepping in close and thrusting his sword towards Ragnar's exposed flank. Ragnar twisted away, the blade grazing his armor. He snarled, "First blood to you, Ironheart, but it will be your last." The two warriors circled each other, each looking for an opening. Their movements were a deadly dance, a testament to their years of experience and skill. Asger's style was fluid and precise, each movement economical and purposeful. Ragnar, in contrast, was all raw power and aggression, his axe cutting wide arcs through the air. From the sidelines, Bjorn watched with bated breath. "Come on, old friend," he muttered. "Show him what honor and skill can do against brute force." As if hearing Bjorn's words, Asger launched into a series of swift attacks. His blade became a blur of motion, forcing Ragnar onto the defensive. The merciless leader grunted with effort as he parried blow after blow, his confident sneer replaced by a grimace of concentration. Asger pressed his advantage, his sword finding chinks in Ragnar's armor. Small cuts appeared on Ragnar's arms and legs, nothing serious but enough to draw blood and fuel the warrior's rage. "Is this all the great Asger Ironheart can do?" Ragnar taunted, even as he retreated under the onslaught. "Scratch me like a cat?" Asger didn't rise to the bait, maintaining his focus. He saw an opening and lunged, his blade aimed at Ragnar's throat. Victory seemed within grasp. But Ragnar had been waiting for this moment. With surprising agility for a man of his size, he dropped to one knee, Asger's sword whistling harmlessly over his head. In the same motion, Ragnar swung his axe in a vicious upward arc. Asger barely managed to leap back, the axe's edge slicing through his cape and grazing his chest plate. The sudden move caught him off balance, and he stumbled. Ragnar pressed his advantage, unleashing a flurry of powerful blows. Asger was forced onto the defensive, his sword a silver blur as he parried and dodged. The watching soldiers gasped and shouted, the tide of the battle suddenly turning. "Come on, Asger," Lydia shouted from the sidelines, her usual composure forgotten in the heat of the moment. "Don't let that brute overwhelm you." The fight intensified, both warriors pushing themselves to their limits. Sweat poured down their faces, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Yet neither showed any sign of yielding. Asger managed to regain his footing, countering Ragnar's brutal assault with swift, precise strikes. The two leaders traded blows at a furious pace, the sound of steel on steel ringing out across the battlefield. The watching soldiers were transfixed. Many had never seen combat at this level, and the display of skill and power was awe-inspiring. Even the most battle-hardened veterans found themselves holding their breath at particularly close calls. As the duel raged on, Asger began to notice something. Ragnar's attacks, while powerful, were becoming more predictable. The merciless leader was tiring, his swings a fraction slower, his footwork a bit less sure. Seizing the opportunity, Asger launched into a complex series of attacks, a technique he had developed over years of combat. His blade danced around Ragnar's defenses, finding weak points in the larger man's guard. Ragnar growled in frustration, his counterattacks becoming wilder and less controlled. "Stand still and die, you honorable fool." Asger didn't respond, conserving his breath for the fight. He pressed his advantage, forcing Ragnar back step by step. Victory once again seemed within reach, but fate had other plans. As Asger brought his sword down in what he hoped would be a finishing blow, there was a terrible sound, a sharp crack that cut through the clash of battle. His trusted blade, which had served him faithfully through countless fights, shattered against Ragnar's upraised axe. Time seemed to stand still. Asger stared in disbelief at the broken hilt in his hand. Ragnar's face split into a triumphant grin. "The gods favor me, Ironheart," Ragnar roared. "Now meet your end." The merciless leader brought his axe down in a mighty overhead swing, aimed at Asger's exposed head. The watching soldiers cried out in horror, certain they were about to witness the death of their beloved leader. But Asger hadn't survived countless battles by relying solely on his weapon. In a move born of desperate instinct, he ducked under Ragnar's swing and surged forward, slamming his shoulder into the larger man's chest. The unexpected move caught Ragnar off guard. He stumbled backward, his axe swing going wide. Asger pressed his advantage, grappling with his opponent at close quarters where Ragnar's longer reach with the axe was a disadvantage. "What's this?" Ragnar snarled. "Resorting to a peasant's brawl, Ironheart?" Asger didn't waste breath on a reply. His mind raced, searching for a way to turn this seemingly hopeless situation to his advantage. Then, he saw it. A chance, risky and unconventional, but possibly his only hope. The battlefield fell silent as Asger stood over the defeated Ragnar, his sword gleaming with victory. For a moment it seemed as if the war had finally come to an end. Asger's troops erupted in cheers, while Ragnar's forces stood in stunned disbelief. But the celebration was short-lived. As Asger raised his sword to signal the end of the duel, a horn blasted in the distance. All eyes turned to the horizon, where a mass of soldiers appeared, their banners unfamiliar to both sides. "By the gods!" Bjorn gasped, rushing to Asger's side. "Who are they?" Asger's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the newcomers. "I don't know, but their timing couldn't be worse." The mysterious army advanced swiftly, their intentions clear. They were not here to congratulate the victor, but to take advantage of two weakened forces. Chaos erupted on the battlefield. Asger's troops scrambled to form defensive positions, while Ragnar's forces, leaderless and confused, began to scatter. Asger knew he had to act fast. He turned to Ragnar, who was struggling to his feet, clutching his wounded side. "Ragnar," Asger called out, his voice carrying over the growing panic. "We don't have much time. This new threat will destroy us both if we don't act together." Ragnar spat blood, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and fury. "Why should I trust you, Ironheart? You've just defeated me." "Because right now I'm offering you a chance to save your people," Asger replied, extending his hand. "And mine. We can settle our differences later, but now we must face this common enemy." For a tense moment, Ragnar stared at Asger's outstretched hand. Then, with a grudging nod, he clasped it. "Men of both armies," Asger shouted, his voice carrying across the field. "A new threat approaches. We must stand together or fall divided. Form ranks and prepare for battle." The next few minutes were a flurry of activity, as the two once-enemy forces scrambled to create a unified front. Asger and Ragnar, despite their recent combat, worked side by side to organize their troops. As the mysterious army drew closer, a rider approached under a flag of truce. Asger, Ragnar, and their top lieutenants gathered to meet him. The rider, a woman with piercing green eyes and elaborate armor, dismounted smoothly. "I am General Era of the Shadowmere Empire," she announced, her voice cold and commanding. "We've come to claim these lands. Surrender now, and you may live to serve our emperor." Asger stepped forward, his posture defiant. "These lands are not yours to claim, General Era. We will not surrender." Era's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Then you will die. But I am not without mercy. I propose a meeting of leaders. You, the brute behind you, and myself. We can discuss terms, or your swift demise." Ragnar growled at being called a brute, but Asger placed a restraining hand on his arm. "We accept your proposal for a meeting," Asger replied. "But know this. We stand united against your aggression." As Era rode back to her lines, Asger turned to Ragnar and Bjorn. "This could be a trap," Bjorn warned. "It could be," Asger agreed. "But it's also our best chance to understand what we're facing. Ragnar, are you with me on this?" Ragnar nodded grimly. "For now, Ironheart. For now." The leaders' meeting was set in neutral ground between the armies. A large tent was erected, guarded by soldiers from all three factions. Inside, a table had been placed with 3 chairs. Asger, Ragnar, and Era took their seats, the tension palpable in the air. Era spoke first, her voice smooth as silk but sharp as a blade. "Gentlemen, let's not waste time. My forces outnumber yours. We are fresh, while you have been weakened by your petty war. Surrender now. Swear fealty to the Shadowmere Empire, and you may yet have a place in the new order." Ragnar slammed his fist on the table. "Never. We'll die before we kneel to you." Asger raised a calming hand. "What General Era fails to understand," he said evenly, "is that our forces, though recently at odds, are now united. We know this land, we've bled for it. Your numerical advantage means little in the face of our combined strength and knowledge of the terrain." Era's eyes narrowed. "You speak of unity, yet I saw you two battling each other mere hours ago. Do you expect me to believe this sudden alliance?" "Believe what you will," Asger replied, "but know this. We will stand together against any outside threat. Your empire will find no easy conquest here." The negotiation continued for hours, with threats and counteroffers flying across the table. As the sun began to set, An uneasy agreement was reached. Asger emerged from the tent, his face grave as he addressed the waiting officers. "We have negotiated a temporary truce," he announced. "The Shadowmere Empire will withdraw to the eastern hills for now. We have 3 days to decide: submit to their rule or face their full might in battle." Murmurs of discontent rippled through the crowd. Bjorn stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "And what of our own truce, my lord? Can we trust Ragnar and his forces?" Asger sighed heavily. "We have no choice, old friend. Ragnar and I have agreed to a temporary alliance. Our survival depends on it." As the news spread through the camps, an air of unease settled over the soldiers. Former enemies now found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder, eyeing each other warily as they prepared for the possibility of battle against this new, unknown force. That night, Asger called a council of war, including both his own advisors and Ragnar's. The tent was crowded, the atmosphere tense as old foes stood side by side. "We have 3 days," Asger began, his voice cutting through the murmurs. 3 days to prepare for either diplomacy or war. We must use this time wisely." Ragnar, his wound bandaged but his spirit unbroken, spoke up. "My scouts report that this Shadowmere Empire has weapons we've never seen before. Strange contraptions that spit fire and metal." Lydia, Asger's chief strategist, nodded grimly. "We've heard rumors of such weapons. If they're true, a direct confrontation could be disastrous." "Then what do you propose?" Ragnar growled. "That we kneel before these invaders?" Asger shook his head. "No. We use what we have. Our knowledge of the land, our combined strength, and the element of surprise. They expect us to be weakened and divided. We'll show them how wrong they are." As the council debated deep into the night, plans were made, strategies formed. Scouts were sent out to gather more information about the Shadowmere forces. Weapons were forged and repaired. Most importantly, the two armies began to train together, turning their hard-won knowledge of each other's tactics into a unified fighting force. On the eve of the 3rd day, Asger stood atop a hill overlooking both camps. The sight of his soldiers working alongside Ragnar's still seemed surreal. Bjorn joined him, his face etched with concern. "The men are ready," Bjorn reported. "But there's still unease. This alliance, it goes against everything we've fought for." Asger nodded, his eyes on the horizon where the Shadowmere army waited. "I know, old friend, but sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unlikely alliances. Tomorrow, we either forge a new peace or face a war unlike any we've seen before." As darkness fell, Asger returned to his tent to prepare for whatever the dawn might bring. The fate of their lands, their people, and their newfound alliance hung in the balance. As dawn broke on the 4th day since the uneasy alliance was formed, Asger found himself restless. The camp was stirring to life, the mingled sounds of his own soldiers and Ragnar's men creating an unfamiliar cacophony. He decided to take a walk, hoping to clear his mind before the crucial meeting with the Shadowmere Empire's representatives. As he moved through the camp, nodding to soldiers who saluted him, Asger's keen eyes noticed something odd. A figure, cloaked and hooded, was slipping between tents, clearly trying to avoid detection. Intrigued and suspicious, Asger decided to follow. The mysterious figure led him to the outskirts of the camp, where the person met with another cloaked individual. Asger crouched behind a stack of supply crates, straining to hear their hushed conversation. "The plan is in motion," the first figure whispered. "When the meeting begins, we strike. The Shadowmere Empire will have no choice but to attack, and in the chaos we'll eliminate both Asger and Ragnar." Asger's blood ran cold. A conspiracy right under his nose. But who could be behind it? As the figures parted ways, Asger managed to catch a glimpse of one of their faces. His heart sank as he recognized Eriksson, one of his most trusted lieutenants. Returning to his tent, Asger's mind raced. He couldn't confront Eriksson directly without proof, and he had no idea how deep this conspiracy ran. He needed to confide in someone, but who could he trust? After much deliberation, He decided to speak with Lydia, his chief strategist. If anyone could help him unravel this plot, it would be her. "Lydia," Asger said as she entered his tent, "we have a serious problem." He recounted what he had overheard, watching Lydia's face carefully for any reaction. Her eyes widened in shock, but Asger detected no hint of deceit. "This is grave news indeed, my lord," Lydia said, her voice low. "But why would Eriksson betray us? And who else might be involved?" Asger shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to find out quickly. The meeting with the Shadowmere Empire is in a few hours. If we don't act, it could be a bloodbath." Together they formulated a plan. Lydia would discreetly investigate Eriksson and his recent activities, while Asger would try to gather more evidence. As Lydia left to begin her investigation, Asger felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him more heavily than ever. He had faced many challenges in battle, but uncovering a conspiracy within his own ranks was a different kind of war altogether. Over the next few hours, Asger carefully observed the camp, paying close attention to Eriksson and those he interacted with. He noticed subtle signals exchanged, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when others approached. The evidence was circumstantial, but it painted a troubling picture. Just before midday, Lydia returned, her face grim. "My lord, I've found something," she said, producing a small scroll. This was hidden in Eriksson's tent. It's a communication from someone in Ragnar's camp, detailing the plan to disrupt the meeting and reignite the war. Asger's heart sank. The betrayal was even more widespread than he had feared. "We need to act now," he said. "Summon Eriksson to my tent. It's time for a confrontation." As they waited for Eriksson to arrive, Asger steeled himself for what was to come. When the lieutenant entered the tent, Asger could see the moment he realized something was wrong. "Eriksson," Asger began, his voice heavy with disappointment, "I've always valued your loyalty and service, which is why what I'm about to ask pains me greatly. Are you involved in a plot to sabotage our alliance with Ragnar and provoke war with the Shadowmere Empire?" Eriksson's face paled, but he quickly composed himself. "My lord, I don't know what you're talking about. I've served you faithfully for years. How could you accuse me of such treachery?" Asger held up the scroll Lydia had found. "This was discovered in your tent. It details the very plot I spoke of. Explain yourself." For a moment, Eriksson looked like he might continue to deny everything. Then, his shoulders sagged, and a different man seemed to emerge, one filled with bitterness and resentment. "You don't understand, Asger," Eriksson spat, dropping all pretense of respect. "This alliance with Ragnar is an abomination. How many of our brothers and sisters did his forces slaughter? And now we're supposed to fight alongside them. Some of us haven't forgotten what it means to have honor." Asger's voice was quiet, but firm. "Honor? There's no honor in betraying your own people, Eriksson. This plot would lead to the deaths of countless more on both sides. Better to die with honor than live as slaves to the Shadowmere Empire," Eriksson shouted. "You've gone soft, Asger. You're not the leader we need anymore." Before anyone could react, Eriksson drew a hidden dagger and lunged at Asger. But years of battle had honed Asger's reflexes. He sidestepped the attack, disarming Eriksson with a swift move. As guards rushed in to restrain the traitor, Asger felt a deep sadness. "Take him away," he ordered, "and send word to Ragnar. We need to meet immediately." The news of Eriksson's betrayal spread through the camp like wildfire. Soldiers whispered among themselves, wondering who else might be involved in the conspiracy. The fragile trust between Asger's forces and Ragnar's began to fracture. In Ragnar's tent, the atmosphere was tense as Asger relayed what had transpired. Ragnar's face darkened with each word. "So," Ragnar growled, "there are traitors in both our camps. How can we trust anyone now?" Asger sighed heavily. "Trust is a luxury we can't afford, Ragnar. But neither can we afford to let this alliance fall apart. The Shadowmere Empire is still at our doorstep." As they discussed how to proceed, word came that soldiers from both sides were beginning to clash. old grudges reigniting in the face of new suspicions. Asger knew he had to make a decision, one that would change the course of the war and possibly the fate of their people. He stood, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the tent. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the arguments. "We cannot let the actions of a few destroy what we've built. Ragnar, I propose something unprecedented. We need to fully integrate our forces." Ragnar's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean we break down the divisions between our armies entirely," Asger explained. "Mix our units, share our command structures, make it impossible for any faction to work against the whole without being discovered." The tent erupted in protests and exclamations of disbelief, but Asger held up his hand for silence. "I know it sounds radical," he continued, "but consider our position. We face an enemy with superior numbers and technology. Our only advantage is our unity and knowledge of the land. We must leverage that to its fullest." Ragnar stroked his beard thoughtfully. "It's a risky move, Asger. Our men might revolt at the idea." "Perhaps," Asger agreed, "but it's a risk we must take. The alternative is to let suspicion tear us apart from within." After hours of heated debate, a decision was reached. Asger and Ragnar emerged from the tent to address their combined forces. The soldiers gathered, tension thick in the air. Asger spoke, his voice carrying across the assembled troops. "Men of both armies, hear me. Today, we uncovered a plot that threatened to destroy our alliance and doom us all. But we will not let the actions of a few define us." He paused, letting his words sink in. "From this day forward, there is no us and them. We are one army, united against a common foe. Our units will be integrated, our command shared. Only together can we hope to survive the storm that's coming." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked uncertain or angry. Asger knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Implementing this plan would be difficult and dangerous. As the sun set on this tumultuous day, Asger stood alone, watching the bustling activity as the two armies began the complex process of integration. He knew that his decision could either save them all or lead to their downfall. But as he observed former enemies cautiously beginning to work together, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps out of this crucible of distrust and betrayal, something stronger could emerge. A truly united force capable of standing against the Shadowmere Empire. With renewed determination, Asger set off to oversee the transformation of their forces. The coming days would test them all, but he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The integration of the two armies had begun, but Asger felt a growing unease. Despite the progress they were making, he couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was missing. As dawn broke on the 5th day since the alliance was formed, Asger made a decision that would change everything. "Bjorn," he called to his most trusted friend and advisor, "I need you to oversee things while I'm gone." Bjorn's brow furrowed with concern. "Gone? Where are you going, Asger?" Asger sighed, his gaze distant. "I don't know exactly, but I feel there are answers I need to find, and I won't find them here in the camp." "But the Shadowmere Empire could attack at any moment," Bjorn protested. "We need you here, leading us." Asger placed a hand on Bjorn's shoulder. "The army is in good hands with you and Ragnar. This journey, it's something I must do alone. I believe it's crucial for our survival." Despite further protests from Bjorn and others, Asger set out alone as the sun rose higher in the sky. He traveled light, carrying only essential supplies and his trusted sword. His path took him deep into the ancient forest that bordered their lands, a place shrouded in mystery and legend. As night fell on the first day of his journey, Asger made camp in a small clearing. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures conspicuously absent. As he sat by his small fire, a voice suddenly spoke from the darkness. "So, the great Asger Ironheart seeks answers in the realm of shadows and whispers." Asger leapt to his feet, sword in hand, scanning the darkness. "Who's there? Show yourself." From the gloom emerged a figure cloaked in robes that seemed to shimmer and shift in the firelight. The figure's face was hidden beneath a deep hood. "Who I am is not important," the figure said, its voice neither male nor female. "What matters is who you are, Asger Ironheart, and who you are meant to become." Asger kept his sword raised, wary of this strange apparition. "Speak plainly. What do you know of me and my purpose?" The figure chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "I know that you seek answers, but are you prepared for the truths you might find? Are you willing to face the darkness within yourself?" Before Asger could respond, the figure raised its hand, and the world around him began to blur and shift. The forest melted away, replaced by swirling mists and shadowy forms. Asger felt as if he were falling, tumbling through layers of reality. When the world solidified again, Asger found himself standing on a battlefield. But this was no ordinary conflict. The combatants were shadowy versions of himself, each representing a different aspect of his personality. He watched as these shadow selves fought brutally, tearing at each other with savage intensity. "What is this?" Asger demanded, his voice echoing strangely in this surreal landscape. The mysterious figure's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "This is the war within you, Asger. The conflict between your desire for peace and your warrior's instinct, between your loyalty to your people and your growing understanding of a larger world." As Asger watched, he began to recognize the different aspects of himself. There was the fierce warrior, driven by rage and the thrill of battle. There was the thoughtful leader, burdened by responsibility. And there, nearly overwhelmed by the others, was a small figure representing hope and compassion. "You must find balance, Asger Ironheart," the voice intoned. "Only by reconciling these warring parts of yourself can you hope to lead your people to victory." Suddenly, the scene shifted again. Asger found himself in a dark cave, facing a mirror that seemed to be made of still water. As he gazed into it, he saw not his reflection, but visions of possible futures. In one, he saw himself leading a great army to glorious victory. In another, he saw himself as a tyrant, ruling with an iron fist over a conquered land. "The future is not set," the mysterious guide said. "Your choices will shape not only your destiny, but the fate of all those who follow you." Asger reached out to touch the mirror, and as his fingers brushed the surface, he was plunged into a whirlwind of images and sensations. He relived key moments of his life, seeing them from new perspectives. He felt the pain of those he had killed, the anguish of families torn apart by war. As the visions intensified, Asger fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the emotions coursing through him. "Enough!" he cried out. "What am I supposed to learn from this torment?" The figure appeared before him, its featureless face somehow radiating compassion. "You must learn to see beyond the immediate, Asger. The conflict you face is part of a pattern that stretches back through time. There is a prophecy, long forgotten by your people, that speaks of a leader who will arise in a time of great darkness." The air around them shimmered and ancient words appeared, glowing with an inner light. "When shadow threatens to engulf the land, a leader shall arise with healing hand. Neither conqueror nor tyrant shall he be, but one who sets the feuding peoples free. Through trials of fire and tests of the soul, shall he forge a nation united and whole." Asger read the words, feeling their weight settle into his very being. "This prophecy, it speaks of me. It speaks of possibility," the figure corrected. "Whether you fulfill this destiny is up to you. But know this, the trials you have faced and the challenges yet to come are all part of your journey to become the leader your people need." With those words, the visionary world began to fade. Asger felt himself falling again, but this time, instead of fear, he felt a sense of purpose and clarity. He awoke with a start, finding himself back in the forest clearing. The fire had burned low, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. The mysterious figure was nowhere to be seen, but Asger knew that his experience had been more than just a dream. As he broke camp and prepared to return to his people, Asger felt profoundly changed. The inner conflict that had been tearing him apart seemed to have settled into a new harmony. He understood now that his strength came not from suppressing parts of himself, but from embracing all aspects of his nature. The journey back to the camp seemed to pass in a blur. As Asger approached, he saw the changes that had taken place in his absence. The once separate armies were now truly beginning to work as one. But he also saw the uncertainty in the eyes of his people, the fear of the unknown future they faced. Bjorn rushed to meet him as he entered the camp. Asger, thank the gods you've returned. The Shadowmere Empire has sent another envoy. They demand an answer by nightfall. Asger nodded, a new sense of calm purpose filling him. Gather the War Council, Bjorn. It's time we charted a new course. As the leaders assembled, many were struck by the change in Asger. There was a new light in his eyes, a certainty in his bearing that inspired confidence. My friends, Asger began, his voice carrying easily through the tent. I have been on a journey, not just of the body but of the spirit. I have seen visions of what might be, and I understand now what we must do. He outlined a plan that was both daring and compassionate, a strategy that would use their newfound unity to outmaneuver the Shadowmere Empire without resorting to all-out war. As he spoke, Asger could see hope kindling in the eyes of those around him. We stand at a crossroads, he concluded. The path ahead will not be easy, but I believe that together we can forge a future brighter than any we could have imagined separately. As the council dispersed to prepare for the coming confrontation with the Shadowmere Empire, Ragnar approached Asger. You've changed, he said gruffly. There's something different about you. Asger smiled, clasping Ragnar's arm in a warrior's grip. We've all changed, my friend, and we'll need to change still more if we're to survive what's coming. But for the first time, I truly believe we can do more than just survive. We can build something new, something better. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the camp, Asger stood alone for a moment, gazing at the horizon. The weight of prophecy and expectation rested heavily on his shoulders, but he no longer felt burdened by it. Instead, he felt empowered, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With a deep breath, Asger turned back to the camp, ready to lead his people into an uncertain but hopeful future. The journey within had transformed him, and now it was time to transform the world around him. As dawn broke over the united camp, Asger gathered his most trusted advisors in his tent. The air was thick with tension as he unveiled his audacious plan. What I'm about to propose will seem mad, Asger began, his voice low and intense. But I believe it's our best chance at victory. Bjorn, Lydia, and Ragnar leaned in, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. We're going to fake my death, Asger declared. The tent erupted in shocked exclamations. Have you lost your mind? Ragnar growled. Lydia's brow furrowed. My lord, how could this possibly help us? Asger raised his hands for silence. Think about it. The Shadowmere Empire believes I'm the linchpin holding our alliance together. If they think I'm dead, they'll expect us to fall into disarray. And while they're busy underestimating us, Bjorn said slowly, realization dawning, we can strike from unexpected angles. Asger nodded, a grim smile on his face. Exactly. But for this to work, the deception must be absolute. Only the four of us can know the truth. Over the next hour, Asger laid out the details of his plan. They would stage an assassination attempt during a public address. Asger would appear to be struck by a poisoned arrow, and in the ensuing chaos, his body would be whisked away. Bjorn, you'll publicly take command, Asger instructed. Ragnar, I need you to play the part of the angry ally, threatening to break the alliance. Make it convincing. Ragnar chuckled darkly. That won't be difficult. As the sun reached its zenith, Asger stood before the combined armies. The soldiers murmured amongst themselves, wondering why they had been assembled. My friends, Asger began, his voice carrying across the crowd. We stand at a crossroads. The Shadowmere Empire thinks they have us cornered, but they underestimate our... His words were cut short as an arrow whistled through the air, striking him in the chest. Asger staggered, clutching at the shaft protruding from his armor. As he fell, chaos erupted. Bjorn rushed to Asger's side, cradling his leader's head. "Find the assassin!" he roared as soldiers scrambled in all directions. In the confusion, Lydia and a small group of trusted guards whisked Asger's body away. Once inside a prepared tent, Asger sat up, removing the specially designed arrow that had only appeared to pierce his armor. "Well," he said, wiping away the fake blood, "that was more convincing than I expected. How long before word reaches the Shadowmere camp?" Lydia peered out of the tent. "Their spies will carry the news within the hour. What's our next move?" "Now," Asger said, his eyes glinting with determination, "we go to work." Over the next few days, the camp was engulfed in apparent mourning. Bjorn took command, his face a mask of grief and anger. Ragnar played his part perfectly, storming around the camp and threatening to leave with his forces. Meanwhile, Asger worked tirelessly from a hidden location. Disguised as a common soldier, he moved through the camp at night, leaving coded messages for his inner circle. A week after his death, the first phase of Asger's plan was put into motion. A small force led by Ragnar launched a seemingly reckless attack on a Shadowmere outpost. The Empire's forces, expecting the alliance to be in disarray, were caught off guard. As news of the victory spread through the camp, Bjorn stood before the armies. "Asger may be gone," he declared, his voice thick with emotion, "but his spirit lives on in each of us. We will show the Shadowmere Empire that we are not so easily broken." The soldiers cheered, their morale surging. Unseen in the crowd, Asger smiled to himself. The deception was working perfectly. Over the next month, a series of coordinated strikes hammered the Shadowmere forces. Each attack seemed to come from a different direction, leaving the enemy confused and off balance. Asger's intimate knowledge of both his own forces and Ragnar's allowed him to devise strategies that leveraged their combined strengths in ways the enemy never anticipated. In the Shadowmere camp, General Era paced furiously before her war council. "How is this possible?" she raged. "Their leader is dead. Their alliance should be crumbling. Instead, they're fighting like demons possessed." One of her advisors spoke up hesitantly. Perhaps Asger Ironheart isn't really dead?" Era rounded on him, her eyes flashing. "Impossible. Our spies confirmed it. No, this is something else. These barbarians are more resilient than we gave them credit for. We need to change our strategy." Back in the Alliance camp, Asger met secretly with his inner circle. "The time has come," he said, his voice low but filled with anticipation. "Tomorrow, we launch our final gambit." As dawn broke the next day, the Shadowmere Empire launched a massive assault, hoping to overwhelm the Alliance with sheer numbers. The battle raged across the plains, with both sides taking heavy losses. Just as it seemed the Alliance might buckle under the onslaught, a horn blasted from a nearby hilltop. All eyes turned to see a figure in gleaming armor atop a white horse. "Impossible," General Era breathed, her face pale with shock. Asger's voice boomed across the battlefield. "Soldiers of the Alliance, the time has come to reveal our true strength." As if by magic, hidden forces emerged from the forests and hills, flanking the Shadowmere army. Caught in a pincer movement, the enemy's lines began to crumble. Asger charged down the hill, his sword flashing in the sunlight. As he reached the front lines, allies and enemies alike stared in disbelief. "Asger Ironheart lives." The cry went up from the Alliance soldiers, their fighting spirit renewed. In the heart of the battle, Asger found himself face to face with General Era. Their swords clashed as around them. The tide of the battle turned decisively in the Alliance's favor. "How?" Era gasped as she parried Asger's blows. "We saw you fall." Asger allowed himself a grim smile. "You saw what we wanted you to see. Your empire's greatest weakness is its arrogance. You underestimated us at every turn." With a final, decisive strike, Asger disarmed Ira. As she fell to her knees, the reality of her defeat sank in. The Shadowmere forces, seeing their leader captured, began to lay down their arms. As the dust settled on the battlefield, Asger stood before the combined armies, his own, Ragnar's, and now the surrendered Shadowmere forces. The air was thick with a mixture of jubilation and disbelief. "My friends," Asger began, his voice carrying easily over the crowd, "today marks not just a victory, but a new beginning. We have proven that together, we are stronger than any force that seeks to divide us." He turned to the captured Shadowmere soldiers. "To you I offer not subjugation, but a choice. Join us in building a new future, or return to your empire with a message. The lands of the Alliance are not to be trifled with." As the sun set on the battlefield, Asger met with Bjorn and Ragnar in his tent. The weight of their deception and the cost of victory hung heavy in the air. "Was it worth it?" Ragnar asked gruffly. "All this deception?" Asger sighed, feeling the weight of every life lost in the conflict. "It saved more lives than it cost. Sometimes, to forge a lasting peace, we must be willing to walk in the shadows." Bjorn clasped Asger's shoulder. "What now, old friend? Where do we go from here?" Asger's eyes gleamed with determination and hope. "Now, we build. We take this hard-won unity and use it to create something greater than any of us could have imagined alone." As night fell over the camp, the celebrations of victory mingled with the somber remembrances of the fallen. Asger stood at the entrance of his tent, watching his people. No longer separate armies, but a single united force. The great deception had brought them victory, but he knew that the real challenge lay ahead, forging a lasting peace from the ashes of war. With a deep breath, Asger stepped out to join his people. The time for hiding was over. Now was the time to lead them into a new era, one built on trust, unity, and the hard-won wisdom that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unexpected strategies. The air was thick with tension as Asger stood before the assembled war council. Maps were spread across the large wooden table, each marked with troop positions and strategic points. The Allied armies had come far, but the Shadowmere Empire still held significant territory. "This is it," Asger declared, his voice grave yet determined. "The final push. We've weakened their supply lines, disrupted their communications, and shaken their confidence. Now is the time to strike at their heart." Ragnar leaned forward, his scarred face etched with concentration. "Their main force is entrenched here," he said, pointing to a heavily fortified position on the map. "A frontal assault would be suicide." Lydia, who had proven herself an invaluable strategist, spoke up. "What if we split our forces? A large army to engage their main force, while a smaller team slips behind enemy lines," Asger finished, nodding in agreement. "Exactly what I was thinking. We need to take out their command structure. Without leadership, their army will crumble." The council spent hours refining the plan. As dawn broke, Asger addressed the Allied armies. Thousands of faces looked up at him, a sea of determination and nervous anticipation. "Today we fight not just for our lands, but for our future," Asger's voice boomed across the gathering. "The Shadowmere Empire thought they could divide us, conquer us. Instead, they've united us as never before. Now we show them the true strength of our alliance." A roar went up from the assembled soldiers, weapons raised in salute. As the main force prepared to march, Asger gathered his small team for the covert mission. "Bjorn, old friend," Asger said, clasping his lieutenant's arm, "I need you to lead the main assault. Keep their attention fixed on you." Bjorn nodded grimly. "And you? This mission behind enemy lines, it's too risky for you to go." Asger's eyes hardened with resolve. "No one else knows their defenses as well as I do. This has to work, Bjorn. Everything depends on it." As the massive Allied army began its advance, Asger's small team of elite warriors slipped away, using hidden paths and ancient smuggling routes to penetrate deep into enemy territory. The sound of battle soon filled the air, a cacophony of clashing steel, thundering hooves, and the cries of the wounded and dying. Bjorn led the charge, his voice rising above the din, rallying the troops as they crashed against the Shadowmere defenses. Miles away, Asger and his team crept through dense forest, every sense alert for signs of enemy patrols. They had to reach the Shadowmere command post, a fortress nestled in the mountains that controlled all enemy operations in the region. "Hold," Asger whispered, raising his fist. The team froze as a Shadowmere patrol passed nearby. Once the danger had passed, they continued their arduous journey. Back on the main battlefield, the fighting was fierce. The Shadowmere forces, though caught off guard by the sudden offensive, fought with the desperation of those who knew defeat meant the end of their empire. Ragnar found himself in the thick of the combat, his massive war axe cleaving through enemy ranks. "For Asger, for the Alliance," he roared, inspiring those around him to push harder. Lydia, coordinating from a command post behind the lines, received reports from across the battlefield. "Send reinforcements to the eastern flank," she ordered. "They're trying to outflank us there." As the day wore on, the toll of battle became increasingly apparent. The ground was littered with the fallen from both sides, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and blood. Meanwhile, Asger's team had reached the outskirts of the Shadowmere command post. The fortress loomed before them, its stone walls seemingly impregnable. There, Asger pointed to a small postern gate, barely visible in the gathering dusk. "That's our way in. Kayla, you're the best climber. You'll go first and secure the rope." Kayla, a lithe warrior from Ragnar's clan, nodded silently and began her ascent. The others watched with bated breath as she scaled the sheer wall. Just as she reached the top, a guard appeared on the ramparts. Time seemed to slow as Asger watched, his heart in his throat. But Kayla was quicker. In one fluid motion, she vaulted over the wall. There was a brief scuffle, and then silence. Moments later, a rope unfurled down the wall. "Go," Asger ordered, and one by one his team climbed into the heart of the enemy stronghold. Once inside, they moved swiftly and silently through the corridors. Years of gathering intelligence had given Asger an intimate knowledge of the fortress's layout. They encountered little resistance at first. Most of the garrison had been sent to reinforce the main battle. As they approached the central command room, however, they ran into a group of elite guards. The clash of steel echoed through the stone halls as Asger and his team fought for their lives. "Press on!" Asger shouted, parrying a vicious blow and countering with a thrust that felled his opponent. "We can't let them raise the alarm." The skirmish was brief but brutal. When it was over, 2 of Asger's team lay dead, and the others sported various wounds. But they had no time to mourn or tend to their injuries. The mission had to succeed, or all would be lost. They burst into the command room, catching the Shadowmere generals by surprise. Maps and battle plans were strewn across tables, and a magical communication device glowed with ethereal light. "Surrender," Asger demanded, his sword pointed at the lead general's throat. "Call off your forces or die here and now." The general's eyes darted around, seeking escape, but finding none. With a defeated sigh, he nodded. "Lower your weapons," he ordered his staff. "It's over." As Asger's team secured the prisoners and began disabling the magical communicators, a commotion outside caught their attention. Kayla, who had been standing watch, rushed in. "My lord," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Enemy reinforcements. They must have been called back from the main battle. We're surrounded." Asger's mind raced. They had achieved their objective, but now faced the prospect of being trapped. He made a quick decision. "Kayla, take half the team and the prisoners. Use the secret tunnel we discovered in the plans. Get word to Bjorn that the command structure has fallen." "And you, my lord?" Kayla asked, though she already knew the answer. Asger's face was grim but determined. "The rest of us will hold them off. Give you time to escape and collapse the tunnel behind you." "But that's an order," Asger said firmly. "The mission must succeed. Go." As Kayla and half the team hurried the prisoners towards the hidden escape route, Asger and the others prepared for their last stand. They barricaded the doors and took up defensive positions. "It's been an honor," one of the warriors said, clasping Asger's arm. Asger nodded, a lump in his throat. "The honor has been mine. Today, we save our people." The sound of battering rams echoed through the fortress as the Shadowmere forces attempted to breach their defenses. Asger and his small band fought with the desperation of those who knew they were living their final moments. One by one, they fell. Asger, his arm bleeding from a deep gash, found himself the last one standing. As the doors finally gave way and enemy soldiers poured in, he allowed himself a small smile. In the distance, he heard the muffled sound of an explosion, the tunnel collapsing. The mission was a success. "For the Alliance," he whispered, raising his sword for one last charge. Miles away on the main battlefield, Bjorn received the news from the breathless and battered survivors of Asger's team. His heart heavy with grief but bursting with pride, he raised his voice to be heard above the din of battle. "Asger has done it," he roared. "Their command is broken. Push forward. Victory is within our grasp." The news spread like wildfire through the Allied ranks. With renewed vigor, they pressed their advantage. The Shadowmere forces, now leaderless and in disarray, began to falter. As the sun set on the blood-soaked fields, the last pockets of resistance crumbled. Ragnar, his armor dented and splattered with blood, found Bjorn amidst the aftermath. "Is it true?" he asked gruffly. "About Asger?" Bjorn nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He gave everything for this victory for all of us." Ragnar's face, usually so fierce, softened with sorrow and respect. "Then we must make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. This alliance, it must endure." As night fell, the celebrations of victory were tempered by the knowledge of its cost. The Allied armies had won, but the price had been high. None felt the loss more keenly than those who had known Asger best. In the command tent, Bjorn, Ragnar, and Lydia gathered around a map of their hard-won territories. The Shadowmere Empire was defeated, but much work remained to secure the peace. "What now?" Lydia asked softly. Bjorn straightened, his voice strong despite his weariness. "Now we build the world Asger dreamed of. A world where former enemies stand as allies, where our unity is our greatest strength." As they began to plan for the future, each silently vowed to honor Asger's memory by making his vision a reality.